Chapter 917. The secret letter from Hillet Manor was sealed in a thick envelope and sent to the Queen's desk overnight. The flame-shaped emblem on the surface of the envelope indicated that it was a secret letter related to the military, but 7 layers of flame patterns indicated that it was not very important. Constance asked the maid to open the envelope, then took a look at the letter and handed it to Prime Minister Nydevan Jr. Hillet Manor was one of the royal family's secret informants in the Floating Cloud Hill area. The secret magic letter from there was naturally related to the Earl of Erewhon. Prime Minister Nydevan Jr. looked at it and shook his head gently. There's no end to it. But the Queen herself did not seem to care too much. She replied, Darius' grandson forced them, but this is what they deserve. On the letter was written in Kurlut's language. Your Majesty, the nobles have already prepared their troops to meet the Count from the Kingdom of Owen. The commander of this army is Earl Jean. They are now resting in Hemlock Town, Valgus Town, or the nearby areas. It is reported that there are 3 other earls and dozens of knights who have responded to the call. When this letter was sent, they should be on their way. This message was sent a day ago. Floating Cloud Hill. The sky in the east was turning white, and the stars were fading away, marking the dawn of a new day. In the red pine forest bathed in the morning light, the Count was anxiously looking at the western horizon. It was as if what Her Majesty had said was true. He was beginning to feel that he had been caught in a trap of his own making. For the 3rd time the Earl of Gideon, in a state of agitation, the scout asked, You went to the east, west, and north. Are you sure you didn't see anyone from the Moore and Cooper families or the Walker family? Not a single person? The scouts were a few experienced knights. Most of them came from various legions and left the army because of fights, injuries, old age, or other problems. They were very experienced. After leaving the army, they either joined a mercenary group or became a retainer of a noble. But at this moment, these old soldiers looked at each other and shook their heads. Sir, no. They said, Sir, no. Yes, we didn't see anyone. Damn it. Have you ever been to Ironwood Town? Count Jean clenched his teeth, almost crumpling his gloves into a ball. Sir, we've been there as well, but the place is peaceful. The local residents don't know what's going on. The riders immediately replied. Then, did you see any signals from the Moore and Cooper families or the Walker family? No, sir. The riders shook their heads in unison. Earl Jean sucked in a breath of cold air. Only one flag? Brendel and Maynard returned to the encampment after a simple investigation of the battlefield. In the war theories of the empires and the neighboring kingdoms, the task of scouting the battlefield was mostly left to the cavalry, and the commander would overlook the entire battlefield from a high vantage point. In a small-scale battle, the entire battlefield would not be more than 10 miles wide, so it was easy for them to scout it. It was easy to have a panoramic view of the entire battlefield. However, Brando and Maynard chose to use the player's method. Even if they used aerial units to map the battlefield and make a sand table as the commander, they only needed to have an intuitive understanding of the entire battlefield. The advantage of this method was that it was more conducive to hiding one's intentions, especially the direction of one's troops entering the battlefield. In the Second Dark War of the Second Dark War, Madara was the first to use this method, but it was carried forward by the players. In this era, it was an extremely advanced tactical idea. However, the news that the gargoyle brought back gave him a huge shock. In the direction where he and Maynard had previously discovered the movement of the aristocratic private army of the Cruz people, they quickly found the army hidden between the red pine forest from the air. Its main body was composed of aristocratic spearmen and some crossbowmen, and they also found a small number of cavalry. These aristocratic private armies were very well equipped, especially the way the spears in the hands of the spearmen reflected light. Basically, all of them were equipped with iron. Even the standard imperial spears with steel tips were very popular in the army, almost reaching more than 80% of them. In addition to the crossbowmen, even the spearmen were equipped with chain mail. The knight was almost all in full armor. This level of equipment was not inferior to Erewhon's frontline legions such as the White Lion Legion and the Black Blade Squad. As for the aristocratic private army, even if it was not common in the Empire, it was not uncommon. Even in the Empire they were not common. They were most likely the personal guards of the Great Lords. And here, those who could be called Great Lords were either Earl Alcorn or Earl Jean. After all, this was the south, not the bank area near the center of the Empire, or the northern area controlled by military aristocrats like Ludwig. But what made Brando feel very strange was that there was only one army in the forest. He repeatedly asked the gargoyle to confirm the emblem on the flag, but it could only distinguish one kind. That emblem is the emblem of Earl Jean. He came here himself, then what about the others? Are they lying in ambush? Brando couldn't help but look at the female knight beside him with some disbelief. Maynard shook her head gently. It was basically impossible to ambush. The gargoyle's vision was very wide. When they swept across the sky, they could almost see the whole surrounding hills. After the Battle of the Black Sword Fortress, the Cruz people understood the existence of gargoyles in their army. Although the aristocrats of the empire were arrogant, they were not stupid. On the contrary, it was impossible for them not to have heard of the gargoyle's ability. Therefore, it was unlikely that they would let their army lie in ambush in vain. Unless they were lying in ambush on the periphery of the battlefield, but in that case they would not be able to support in time. If they were to lie in ambush so blatantly, wouldn't they be treated as fools? Would Earl Jean bring 1,000 men to fight them to the death? It was impossible even if one used their knees to think. Although the Summer Solstice Knight Regiment that was defeated by them at that time was about the same number of knights, but as a local knight regiment of the Empire, they were much more powerful than the private army of the aristocrats. Because the female knight instinctively thought that there was no such possibility. Brando naturally knew this point. The only remaining possibility was that the enemy's army was covered by magic. Such a case only appeared in history after the Third War of the Black Rose. The first to use it was the Fanzin, and then it gradually spread. If the Earl really came up with such a brilliant idea in this era, he could be considered an outstanding tactical talent. However, the prerequisite for this was to have an independent and centralized wizard group. The size of this wizard group was far beyond the wizards under Brendel's command. Not to mention whether the Kurlutz people could assemble such a wizard group in such a short time. Even if they did, their hidden army was a little too much. He patted his forehead and for a moment he was confused. What are Cruz's people trying to do? Maynard also shook her head in confusion. She had never seen such a battle in her dream, and the military knowledge and tactical skills she had learned in this life did not seem to be able to explain what Cruz's people were trying to do at this moment. Unable to detect the enemy's movements, Brando did not dare to act rashly. Although he knew that he had overwhelming power in his hands, he did not want to cause unnecessary losses in a small fight with the nobles of the Empire. Secondly, he did not want to use some of his trump cards in such a low-level conflict. He thought about it for a moment and decided to let the White Lion Guard stand by. In the ground, he arranged for the iron puppets provided by the Buga wizards to be back up on both sides. He had not used these secret weapons in previous battles, but the current situation was a bit strange and he had to be careful. Fortunately, the only advantage he had now was that he had discovered the enemy, but the enemy had not yet discovered them. He had time to wait for the Earl's next move to see if the other party would reveal any flaws. Time passed by slowly, and the morning fog gradually faded from the hilly area. At first, it was the open hills, and then the light in the forest gradually became brighter. The sun moved a little bit to the middle of the sky, and the visibility in the hilly area was getting better and better. Brando stood behind the bush and gradually could see the outside of the forest with his naked eyes. There were a few flags scattered in the forest, but what made him very confused was, almost 2 or 3 hours had passed and the enemy still did not move. Did they discover us? Brando thought for a while, but he could not explain what was happening at the moment. This was the only way to the Evergreen Corridor, so it was reasonable for the Earl to stay here, but the problem was that he had not seen the other party send any scouts in this direction. Earl Jean seemed to have gone crazy. The army was holed up in the forest, and it did not look like an ambush, but more like they were simply hiding. But the problem was, if the other party wanted to hide, wouldn't it be better if he did not leave his castle? Why did he have to come to the wilderness to suffer? Brando was puzzled, but at this time Earl Jean was actually more anxious than him. The Earl of the Empire was really going crazy. The feud between the southern nobles and the country bumpkin from Erwin had attracted the attention of the entire empire. From the nobles of the kingdom to the commoners, even the people who really held the highest power in the empire moved their eyes away from the two ongoing and temporarily silent holy wars to watch the show. It was precisely because of this reason that no matter who it was, he or Earl Alcorn, absolutely could not retreat half a step. Otherwise, they would become the laughingstock of countless people. Behind them was the Pallet family, and Duke Pallet would also lose a lot of prestige and face because of this. This account would naturally be counted on them in the end. Therefore, he made an agreement with Earl Alcorn that they must stop the Earl from Erwin in the Floating Cloud Hills. They did not expect to completely defeat the other party. They still had self-awareness and understood that the combat strength of their troops was not as good as the Empire's Border Legion. They were not even a match for the Solstice Knight Regiment. But at least they had to make the other party feel troubled. If they could save the noble hostages in their hands, then it would be a happy ending. For this reason, they gathered almost all the local nobles in the southern territory who stood on the side of the Pallet family, including 4 long-established families and countless lords and knights of all sizes. Although this army was mixed, there were at least tens of thousands of people gathered together. In their opinion, it should be more than enough to deal with an envoy group of only a few hundred people. There was more than enough. However, at the last moment when everything was ready and only the east wind was missing on this morning, he encountered an unexpected problem. Earl Jean seemed to have suddenly lost contact with all his other allies. These allies should have been stationed near the various settlements or towns in this area. He had even sent people to contact them one by one the day before. But now, these people seemed to have evaporated into thin air and disappeared for no reason. The Earl's forehead was drenched in cold sweat. The first thought that popped into his mind was whether he had been betrayed by those damned bastards. But this thought only existed instinctively for a split second before it was rejected by him. He understood that anyone else could go back on their word against him, but it was absolutely impossible for Earl Alcorn to do so. The two of them were on the same boat. However, if he accidentally capsized, then he would definitely not be the only one who would have to face Duke Pallet's thunderous anger. Then the only possibility was that his allies had been unknowingly killed off by the terrifying Aween man in front of him. Originally, this idea was very absurd. It sounded like a fantasy for an envoy group of a few hundred people to quietly get rid of tens of thousands of nobles' private armies within a radius of dozens of miles without alerting each other. But now, the more the Earl thought about it, the more he felt that it was possible. He had not really had any dealings with Brando before, although Brando had captured some of his subordinates. He had many nobles under his command, and one of them was even his nephew, but the previous conflicts were actually private conflicts between these local nobles and Brando. If not for Brando's insistence on holding these hostages and slapping him in Earl Alcorn's face, and even slapping the face of the big shot behind them, he would not have wanted to deal with such a lunatic. But although he had never met the Earl of the Kingdom, he had heard a lot of rumors about Brando. The most clear one was the part where he attacked the Imperial fortress. It was an entire legion that was completely subdued by him. They were neither defeated nor defeated, but were completely captured and forced to do as he wished. Do things. Earl Jean suddenly realized that he might have done something stupid. He actually thought that he could defeat such a terrifying person. Even if he had tens of thousands of men under his command, how could he compare to the Rogerian Border Legion? At this time the Earl's mind was full of nonsense. He sent his men to continue to the direction of his allies' camp to find out what happened. If he could not meet them on the road, then at least go to their previous camp. If they were not there or if they found traces of the battle, Earl Jean thought for a moment. How could he arrange a safe escape route for himself? But not long after, the scouts he sent out finally came back on horseback. Although these riders looked travel-worn and exhausted, there were no bloodstains on their bodies and no one showed any signs of injury. This meant that they were not intercepted. This discovery made Earl Jean a little relieved. He quickly asked, "What about Moore Walker and the Cooper family? And what about Count Alcorn? Did you find them?" He asked the questions in his heart like a machine gun, but before he said 2 sentences he suddenly stopped. Because he saw that his men were looking at him with a very strange look, which made his hair stand on end. What's going on? He subconsciously felt that the problem might be a little serious, even beyond his expectations. The oldest of the scouts licked his lips and could not help but answer with a somewhat dry voice, "My lord, Earl Alcorn and the others? What's wrong with them? Can you not look like you've seen a ghost? Well, even if there are really undead, it's not like you haven't dealt with those things before?" Earl Jean frowned and looked at his subordinates with great dissatisfaction. The reason why he took them in was because of the experience of these veterans, but these people had never behaved like this in the past. Even when they climbed out of a pile of corpses, they did not behave like this. But at this time, suddenly, a messenger ran back from the front, trembling. His face was pale and he ran while shouting, "My lord, it's Erwin's people, they're here." Earl Jean was shocked. This was what he was most afraid of now. He quickly turned around and looked at the guy. "What did you say, Erwin's people are here? Is it Erwin's envoy group?" But the messenger kept shaking his head. "No, it's those dragons. Blue, green, so many of them, they're all over the sky. Come and take a look, my lord." The guy's voice was almost wailing. After waiting for another long hour, Brando finally found that the strange noble army in front of him did not seem to intend to move, but at this time, he finally lost his last bit of patience. Although he had already imagined all kinds of possible situations, this was obviously an exception. Obviously, he could not endlessly waste time here with the Earl. If the Earl did this to provoke him to take the initiative to attack, He had to admit that he did it. Fortunately, this was not a particularly complicated problem for Brando. Although it was not up to him to attack or not, the choice of how to attack was in his hands. Of course, he could not expose his intentions to the other side first. Since the other side wanted to see what he had, the best way was to let the Shire command the ether dragons to test the waters. And so he did. But the final result was far beyond his expectations. In fact, it was also beyond the expectations of Maynard, the Shire, and even the little Princess Medisha. The Shire had just let the ether dragons enter the battlefield when a person ran out from Earl Jean's army. Brando was sure that if he was not mistaken, that person was holding a white flag in his hand. At that moment even he could not help but be deeply confused. Could it be that the Earl came here to surrender to him? Is this how the people of Cruz fight? Chapter 9:18. Great Glacier. This was a world of ice and snow. The glaciers crisscrossed like stacked glass, forming a crystal-clear world. The biting cold wind carried snow all year round, like a sharp blade, carving deep scars on the smooth ice surface. Day after day, it formed the rugged and strange landscape of this place. However, in such a harsh and dangerous environment, there were still outsiders. An old sorcerer in a silver robe was struggling to sneak through the snow. He held an ivory staff in one hand and a pointy sorcerer's hat that looked like it could be blown away at any time. His snow-white beard fluttered wildly in the bone-chilling icy wind as he stepped into the knee-high snow. The staff in his hand was called Tyr, which meant knowledge. It was owned by the Bugas. It was the three keys to the truth, knowledge, wisdom, and reason. However, this divine artifact was now used as a walking stick. The old sorcerer moved slowly along the valley as small as an ant. He crossed the blue ice and came to an open space and stopped. This was a huge valley. Black rocks protruded from the snow, forming steep peaks around. Between the peaks, the wind and snow were much lighter. The old sorcerer looked around. There was a man-made building in the valley. It was supposed to be a tower suspended in mid-air. It was a bit like a beautiful obelisk. It was snow-white and hundreds of feet high. However, it had already collapsed. Part of its wreckage had been buried under the snow. The surface that was originally covered with mysterious patterns was also frozen. It was obvious that the destruction was not recent. The third one. The old sorcerer shook his head and said to himself. As if in response to his words, a disdainful snort came from the cold wind. It was a woman's voice. It was low and hoarse, but it was full of majesty and power. William, I told you that you would come back here. How about it? You should have noticed that the boundary of order is rapidly fading, and the fragile laws are collapsing day by day. Everything is as described in the prophecy. But your laughable efforts were in vain. This time there will be no idiot to save you. The old sorcerer, or perhaps one of the most powerful beings in this world, one of the 12 silver rings, the master of Canage, the lord of time and space, did not even flinch. My esteemed Lady Fuchsia Cath, or should I call you the Seven Dragons, or should I call you the evil dragon Fuchsia, or Dalastair, the daughter of the dragon lord of storms and time? Son. This cold snort seemed to transform into a storm, causing icy winds to blow in the valley. The woman replied coldly, If you really respect me so much, why would you imprison me in this place? My eyes have seen through 3,000 years. Ever since you chose to betray me, I have been waiting here, waiting for you to taste your own medicine. Now that you have returned here, tell me? She said coldly, I have been waiting for you to taste your own medicine. What are you thinking about right now? Lady Fuchsia Cath, no one has ever regretted their actions. William replied in a clear voice as he faced the biting snow and wind. Do you see the waves on the Sea of Mana, William? Why don't you take a guess? What is brewing beneath the calm surface? The voice sneered. William raised his eyebrows slightly. I know you know Lady Fuchsia Cath. I'm here today to ask you something. What do you see happening in the east? We can feel that the laws of Tiamat are changing at a speed that has not been seen for thousands of years. We don't understand what is happening. The tide of mana is rising day after day. The moon is reflecting the turbulence on the surface of the sea in another world, but we can't find the reason behind it. What do you see? Fuchsia Cath asked. In just one short month we have lost 30 observation points. Just as you said, the borders of order are rapidly disappearing. We have lost 3 sacred towers in the Great Glacier alone. The woman laughed contemptuously. I saw the flame sea being extinguished with my own eyes. I knew you would come here. Then tell me, what else did you see? During the harvest moon, our wizard saw the black moon. The black moon, Fuchsia Cath chuckled. The 13th moon, she has finally appeared. Isn't it beautiful? She destroyed Calida, and the people who were there that day saw a strange scene. What kind of strange? The tower, as if it was immersed in the darkness of the night. William answered. Babel's reflection, Fuchsia Cath replied. But that is not the reason why you are here. William raised his head and stared at the mountains around the valley. Then he replied, I feel that all the observation points in the eastern region have shifted at the same time. You suspect that I'm behind this? William did not answer. Ridiculous, Fuchsia Cath sneered. Let me give you a piece of advice, William. The moon has lost. Even though it was winter, the temperature on this day was abnormally high. The sun was far away in the sky, but after crossing the median line, it shone brightly on the ground, causing everyone to become a little impatient as they waited. Count Jean and his army had surrendered for a while. Brando thought it was a trap at first, but after some probing he realized that it was a trap. However, he found that the other side was sincere. Although he didn't know what these Kurlutz nobles were up to, he still successfully took down their weapons and temporarily detained the noble army in the Red Pine Forest. He now only wanted Dragon to know one thing: what was wrong with the Count on the opposite side. The Count did not want to meet him personally, so he had to ask Princess Magadal and the Shire to do it for him. He waited for a while until the Shire finally came back from the Red Pine Forest. The first thing the young wizard said was, My lord, we have found out what happened. Brando looked at him calmly. He was not in a hurry to speak, even though this was the answer he had wanted for a long time. The Shire then replied, The Moor, Cooper, Walker and Count Alcorn are not lying in ambush around here. In fact, since this morning, no, since last night, Count Jean has not been able to contact them. What do you mean? Brando did not understand the answer for a while. He frowned slightly and asked. I'm not sure. Count Jean did not explain it clearly either. According to his description, those people seemed to have disappeared. He thought it was us who did it, so he was forced to surrender to us. The Shire replied with some amusement. The Count seemed to be scared out of his wits. Disappeared? Brando was stunned for a moment before he asked, What does that mean? The Shire replied, It means that the Moor and Cooper armies were stationed in Hemlock Town 3 days ago until yesterday. The Walker army was stationed in Vargas Town, and Count Alcorn was stationed near the Boulevard of Leaves. But now these armies have all disappeared. At least Count Jean could not contact them. Is that possible? Brando felt that it was simply unbelievable. Are you sure this is not a trap? Did our gargoyles search the surrounding area carefully? His question was actually nonsense. Long before this, they had already searched the surrounding area several times. After confirming that there were no traces of the enemy, they dared to come out and accept Count Jean's surrender. Moreover, even if this was a trap, the Count would have thought of a way to at least make up a lie that was consistent with common sense. He would not have made up such a ridiculous story. The more ridiculous the Count's description of the matter was, the more reliable his words were. The Shire shook his head gently. It seems that he is not lying. You did not see the Count's face. You seemed to be really scared. He did not want to see you. Most likely he was afraid that you would harm him. Brando shook his head in disbelief. Did you send gargoyles and scouts to Hemlock Town, Vargas Town, and the Boulevard of Leaves? You have to ask Medisha and Maynard about this. My lord, I am not responsible for this. The Shire replied. Brando finally remembered. He could not help but pat his head, thinking that he was completely confused by the strange situation. So he hurried to find Medisha. The latter was arranging for the crew's captives to be settled. This batch of captives was the largest batch they had taken in along the way. There were no less than 1,000 people, and many of them were not nobles. There were also mercenaries, farmers, craftsmen, and soldiers. These people were more troublesome to deal with than the nobles because they had to provide them with food. According to the Shire's words, these people might as well be released. Brando was tempted by this proposal, but he knew that he could not be so hasty because his intentions would be too obvious. When he found Medisa, he asked about the scouts and the gargoyles. The Silver Elf Princess seemed to have expected that he would come looking for her, and immediately replied, My lord, Valgas Town and the Forest Avenue are quite far from here, but the gargoyles that were sent to Hemlock Town have returned once. Just like what the Count said, there was not a single person in the area, and there was no one there. There were no traces of battle. No traces of battle? Medisha nodded. Or did Count Alcons get wind of this beforehand and abandoned Count Jean and ran away by himself? Brendel thought to himself. Or did Count Alcons get wind of this beforehand? But this reason sounded a bit ridiculous. If he ran alone, then there was no need to bring Moore, Cooper, and the Walker families knight and lord. But if he had the ability to inform others to run together, then he might not have left Count Jean behind. Even if he wanted to sell his teammates, his first choice should be those powerless nobles. Brando really didn't see the need for the other party to fall out with the Jean family. But if it was any other possibility, it would be even stranger because there was no reason at all. He asked Charles to ask the Count a few more times, but the answer he got was the same. This made him confused for a while. Although it was a rare thing to be able to win without bloodshed, it was still a good thing. However, the problem was that the current situation made one's hair stand on end. An army of thousands of people in an area of dozens of kilometers had actually been destroyed in a single night. Suddenly disappeared into thin air. What kind of situation was this? In desperation, Brando could only let the envoy group stop and wait for the gargoyles and scouts to return from town of Valgus and the Boulevard of Leaves. From Count Jean's description, he faintly felt that something was wrong. It was like an instinctive premonition of danger. He had experienced all kinds of abnormal situations in the game, and these experiences provided him with rich experience to deal with all kinds of situations. It was a sudden situation. At 1 o'clock in the afternoon, the gargoyles still hadn't returned from town of Valgus and the Boulevard of Leaves. However, at this time, Maynard finally returned to the White Lion Guards from the envoy group. Her main task was to send the young prince and the others in the envoy group, including the noble captives of the Cruz people, to join the main force here. Brando felt that there was something wrong with this battle. That was why he sent this female knight, who was more reliable, to handle this matter. Under normal circumstances, Roman and Dilfrey were in charge of this matter. After Maynard returned to the White Lion Guards and heard the description of the others, she immediately frowned. How far is this place from Rokizi, the fortress group of the Broken Sword Mountains? Brendel immediately understood what she was thinking. They had worked together for a long time, and sometimes they could understand each other with just a glance or a word. He immediately shook his head. This place is not far from Rokizi, the closest fortress in the Broken Sword Mountain range, but it's very far from Toquinen. This is the Floating Cloud Hills, and according to the nearest map, it's not far from here. Rest, the Lion Beastmen of Toquinen are still in the south of the Anzaruta Mountains. Even if they break through the fortress at the same time we receive the news, it is impossible for them to reach here. Not to mention that they are still biding their time there, the Shire added. Brando nodded but then said, "But we can't rule out the possibility that the nobles are providing us with false information." "What's in it for them, my lord?" the Shire asked. "There's no benefit," Brendel replied. "The Kurlutz nobles can't possibly side with the Lion Beastmen, so there's no point in them lying to us about this. But the problem is, what if the information they received is not accurate?" But this time Medisha shook her head. "My lord, we have been collecting similar information from the captives according to Maynard's instructions, but the rumors we received were similar. Unless the Lion Beastmen are deliberately deceiving the Empire, what the nobles said should be true." "Unless the Lion Beastmen are deliberately deceiving the Empire?" Brando suddenly caught this sentence. He glanced at Maynard. According to their earlier analysis, the Lion Beastmen were biding their time in the south of Rokizi, the Broken Sword Mountains. Unless there was some internal conflict, or they were deliberately deceiving the Empire's border army. The possibility of the former was very small. The Lion Beastmen were a clan kingdom under the leadership of the Great Chief and the High Priest. Under the leadership of the Great Chief and the High Priest, if there was no conflict between the two, then it was almost impossible for there to be any internal conflict within the army. Perhaps there would be some small conflicts between the tribes, but it would not affect the overall situation. As for the relationship between the Great Chief and the High Priest, the possibility of there being any problems was even smaller. The leader of Toquinen in this era was the Lion King, or a famous monarch. He was the student of the High Priest of this generation, and there were no rumors of any unhappiness between the two. But if it was not the former, then it could only be the latter. But before this, Brando did not have enough information, so he could only put aside the movements of the Lion Beastmen for the time being. But now, when Medisha reminded him, he immediately remembered and asked, "Senior, is there a tunnel under Anzaruta left by the ancient dwarves?" In a moment of desperation he accidentally called out the name of Allium Japonicum when he was in the other world. But fortunately the others did not seem to notice this detail. Only Maynard looked at him indifferently and shook her head. There are indeed dwarven attacks under Anzaruta, but it is unlikely that the Lion Beastmen of Toquinen will use them. "Why?" Brando was slightly startled and asked. Chapter 9:19. There was an ancient kingdom of dwarves under the Anzaruta Mountains. They were a branch of the Broken Sword Mountains. When the kingdom was digging underground, they accidentally dug through the beehive. After that, the underground was filled with monsters. The kingdom was destroyed and the remaining dwarves migrated westward. The map of the underground kingdom was lost. Right now, that dark maze is full of danger. Passing through it requires unimaginable risk. Even if we ignore these difficulties, it's not something that can be done in a month or two if the dwarves want to dig out a passage from the hard rock layer and connect the lost tunnels. Maynard replied. That's right, Norton said. After Maynard reminded him, Brando also remembered this matter. After all, he was not as familiar with crews as he was with Erwin. That was why he asked. After hearing about the strange incident that happened to Count Jean, Hao Ren's first thought was that the nobles were up to something. But then he remembered that the Lion Beast men of Toquinen had played a trick and bypassed Rokizi. He had a hunch that the Broken Sword Mountains had attacked the Empire just like in history. But now, after some discussion, he found that it was not likely. His train of thought, which had finally cleared up, was now in a state of chaos again. He had to stop and wait for further information. 20 minutes later, the first batch of gargoyles that went to Vargos came back. Medisha came to him with the imaging crystal that she had taken from the gargoyles. She hesitated and said, "My lord, what's wrong?" Medisha shook her head slightly. Unlike the Shire's frivolity, the Silver Elf Princess never boasted or made promises. She just handed the imaging crystal to Brando and said, "My lord, please take a look at it yourself." Brando took the imaging crystal. This kind of recording crystal was not rare in Wond, but it was not ordinary either. It could record a few 3 to 5 minute sound clips and preserve them for years to decades. The fact that the Bugas dared to put it on every gargoyle was enough to prove the magician's wealth. He infused it with magic and the crystal glowed. Then it showed the images that the gargoyles saw when they were flying high in the sky. In the image, the forest was like a thick carpet, and there were some plots of land of different shades at the edge. Those were farmland dotted with red roofs, barns, windmills, and other buildings. No one spoke. Maynard and Brando had already recognized that this was the outskirts of Vargos. It was an Empire-style idyllic scene. But then they saw a strange scene. The gargoyles flew over the town, and the red roofs began to become denser. Several roads like veins went through the bustling market. But in such a big town, there were no pedestrians on the streets, and there were no flocks of birds flying in the dense shade of the trees. It was like a ghost town. After that, they found some strange things in Vargas's square. They looked like grains of sand scattered all over the place. Brendel took a closer look and realized that they were either humans or similar creatures, but they stood still in the square like statues. What's going on? The Shire was stunned. Could it be that there was a sudden monster attack near Vargos, and the whole area was attacked by either the death-eyed wyverns or the petrifying lizards? Brando shook his head. Death-eyed wyverns were not social creatures, and they mostly moved alone outside of mating season. The petrifying lizards were even more territorial creatures and would not rashly come to the human world. These two monsters were unlikely to turn a human town into a ghost town. The only possibility was that this was an organized attack. He already had a candidate in mind. He looked back at Maynard and saw the same guess in her dark eyes. It's the people of the Snake Queen, the cursed for all eternity. Medusa. The Shire was speechless. Aren't they underground in Georgandy Ridge? How could they come to the surface so easily? The denizens of the underground would not easily go to the surface world. They had to go from Georgandy Ridge through the huge beehive above the dome, and then through the underground cavities of the shallow surface, and the rivers that seeped into the underground. It was a long and dangerous journey. Tajiv and its tribesmen had once walked this path. During that migration, countless subterranean dwellers died along the way. They died from disappearances, attacks from monsters, and the most terrible of all, diseases and starvation. However, it was proven that if necessary they would still dare to try. This was the unique tenacity of the subterranean dwellers. "I remember," Brando muttered. "The denizens of Georgandy Ridge also believe in the goddess of earth, right?" "That's impossible." The Shire was a little surprised. "The denizens of the underground believe in the goddess above, and the denizens of the surface believe in the goddess below. Although their beliefs came from the same source, that was 1,000 years ago. Since the Great Schism, the dwarves and lion men on the surface no longer have any contact with the denizens of the underground. How could they come together, and how could they have contacted each other in such a short period of time? Before the Great Schism, the denizens of the surface and the denizens of the underground did believe in the same goddess. But since the War of the Holy Saints, due to the loss of faith and other problems, the Temple of the Earth was no longer the same as it used to be. Even the 3 sacred relics of the Temple of the Earth in Broken Sword Mountains had disappeared one by one. Since then, many sects that believed in the goddess of Earth had been in conflict. The 2 largest sects, Toquenin and Georgiandy Ridge, had long gone their separate ways. It had been 1,000 years since then. Brando of course knew that, but at that moment, he had a gloomy thought in his mind. What were the lion men waiting for on the other side of Rokiki, the fortress of Broken Sword Mountains? He looked at Maynard. The knight frowned and nodded slightly at him. "How sure are you?" he asked pointedly. "If the attackers are indeed from Georgiandy Ridge, then the strange behavior of the lion men is most likely related to them," the knight replied calmly. Everyone was silent. They were wondering if the line of defense could hold if the Golden Mane lion men of Toquenin and the denizens of Georgiandy Ridge attacked Rokiki, the fortress of Broken Sword Mountains. Rokiki, the fortress of Broken Sword Mountains, might be in danger. Even the Shire himself was shocked when he said this. Although he claimed to be knowledgeable, knowledge made him silent. In his eyes, the strength of the empire was based on detailed data, analysis and rational thinking. It was like the mighty crew's golden eagle, which was made up of feathers, but its sharp claws and beak showed how powerful it was. Rokiki, the fortress of Broken Sword Mountains, was the empire's long-established line of defense. It was located between the mountains. The frost and snow of the highlands formed its sturdiness, and the rugged rocks were its blades. The harsh weather all year round told of its ruthlessness and indifference. It was an insurmountable moat. Even if the lion men could take down 1 or 2 of the fortresses, it would be a frivolous joke to say that they could defeat the entire line of defense. However, Brando and Maynard were extremely calm when they heard this. This was something that they had expected. The shock brought by the first and the second time was completely different. They had witnessed the fall of the invincible line of defense in history, so they were very calm now. Although it's just a speculation, we have to prepare for the worst. If everything is true, where is the army of Georgiandy Ridge now? How big is their scale? Rokiki, the loss of the fortress of Broken Sword Mountains, we have to reevaluate everything. The key is whether the threat close at hand, the army of Georgiandy Ridge that annihilated Count Alcon's army, has learned of our existence. We have to first confirm the danger around us. Brando thought for a moment and replied. Maynard looked at him and nodded in agreement. The Shire also looked at his feudal lord in surprise. "Martha above, my feudal lord, I almost thought that you also graduated from the Royal Knight Academy. This is the knowledge of the mercenaries. My lord, when did you learn this from Yuta?" This flattery was just right. Brando couldn't help but feel a little funny and replied, "There are still many things that you don't know." "Of course. Otherwise, why would you be the feudal lord and I'm just a little follower?" The Shire smiled and teased without a care. Medisha also covered her mouth and laughed, then asked, "My feudal lord, what should we do next?" "Let's call the others first. This is a big matter. We have to let them know first. Otherwise, the Duchess will say that you don't respect them again." Medisha replied with a smile, arbitrary and opinionated. "Yes, I'm annoyed to death by her." Brando sighed and pretended to reply helplessly. The little princess couldn't help but giggle. "Get the hell down, damn bastard." Rogers roared and stabbed the troglodyte in the chest. He then lifted his leather boot and kicked it down the stairs. But because he used too much force, he couldn't even pull out his sword. He could only watch the troglodyte roll down the dark corridor with the disgusting creature. But in an instant he saw 1 or 2 flashes of light in the darkness. His heart trembled and he hurriedly lowered his head. Bang! Bang! 2 spears were inserted into the door frame above his head. The tails of the spears were still trembling slightly. He was startled and no longer cared about snatching back his sword. He hurriedly took a step back and closed the door. Then he dragged the cabinet and bed next to him to block the door with all his might. A moment later, the sound of 2 heavy objects hitting the door came from the door, followed by a squeaking scream. Rogers breathed a sigh of relief. He turned around covered in blood and looked at the 4 people left in the empty room with a wry smile. Out of the 12 people, only a few of them were left. Since the beginning of the Nedwin era, the royal family of Cruz had placed spies and eyes all over the empire. And they were the knight of the imperial court stationed in the Hillet Villa. Their task was not to participate in local defense. These monsters came out of nowhere and entangled them. There were so many of them that they suffered heavy losses overnight. They had no choice but to escape to this farm for self-protection. But in fact, all the remaining people understood that the so-called self-protection would not last long. A tall man with curly hair was leaving the window. He put down the curtains and the light in the room immediately dimmed. He shrugged and said to the others, "They have surrounded the outside. Seems like they want to teach us a lesson. Rogers, you killed a lot of these things. I don't think they want to let you go. Do you have any last words? Maybe if I'm lucky enough to survive, I can carve them on your epitaph. Master Rogers, Sikuin is dying. In the corner of the room, a female knight who was holding her companion who was covered in blood looked up and said sadly. The knight in her arms had a deep wound on his chest, but it was not a fatal wound. The fatal wound was on the back of his head. The female knight was holding one of her hands there. Blood flowed down her hand like a stream. Pray for him, Nasha. Rogers sighed. The only person in the room who did not speak was a young man in a long robe. He was concentrating on putting the parchment in his hand into the fire in the middle of the room. He lowered his head, and only the bright light of the fire was reflected in his dark eyes. It was as if this was an incomparably sacred task for him. Rogers looked at the young man and shook his head. He then asked the others, "What was that? Did you see it clearly? Have you heard of it?" "I think it was a meteor." "Ha, too bad I didn't have time to make a wish at the time," the tall man continued. "But we ran into these subterranean dwellers on the way here. I suspect that there's some sort of connection between the two. Normally, these things wouldn't come to the surface." Rogers was silent for a moment before he said with certainty, "I don't think it's that simple. We have to find a way to inform His Majesty." The female knight silently prayed for her companion. The young man who was burning the parchment looked up at the others and said concisely, "I can't do it." "Can't do it?" Rogers stared at his companion in confusion. Ko was the most outstanding wizard in their group. No matter what the situation was, he could always send out a magic message. The young man did not speak. He only stretched out his 5 fingers. Everyone saw a flicker of flame between his fingertips, but it disappeared in a flash, leaving behind a few faint golden red lines. "What's going on?" The tall man could not help but widen his eyes. "Your tricks didn't work? That's impossible, Ka. You're the best." The young man looked at them and said, "Magic is out of order." "What do you mean?" Rogers frowned. "Something is interfering with the law." "What is it?" "A more powerful spell, a divine artifact, or some unknown existence." The young man replied. Rogers' face became serious. "If all the coincidences come together, then it's probably not a coincidence. Nasha, Trevor, I think we may have encountered the worst-case scenario." "What could be worse than this?" the tall man asked. Before he could finish his sentence, he heard a loud crashing sound from outside the door. Then, with a crisp cracking sound, a crack appeared on the wooden door. He looked in that direction, dumbfounded, while the others looked at him unhappily. The latter could only helplessly spread out his hands. "Well, I'm a jinx. Pretend I didn't say anything." Rogers took the sword from the severely injured knight and said to the others, "We have to try to break out. His Majesty is still waiting for our news." As he spoke, he pulled out his sword. Brando began to issue orders one by one. The outer perimeter of the diplomatic group was first expanded. Gargoyles were constantly flying in the sky, guarding against the possible existence of Georgiandy Ridge's army. However, there was nothing unusual in the open hills and forest around the diplomatic group. Brando further expanded the search area and sent the young Sentinel cavalry belonging to the White Lion Guards to Vargas and Linya Avenue. His efforts were not in vain. Soon these Sentinel cavalry found valuable information. The cavalry avoided the main road and entered the area of Vargas and Linya Avenue along the small roads in the Floating Cloud Hill area. They did not encounter any Georgiandy Ridge troops along the way, but when they passed by a village called Tuya near Vargas, they happened to encounter a small group of cavemen besieging a nearby farm. The captain of the Sentinel cavalry was a student who graduated from the Royal Knight Academy. He immediately determined that there might be survivors in the manor, so he immediately led his men to kill the cavemen and rescue the people inside. Brando soon saw these people. It was a group of 4 people, 3 men and 1 woman. When they were brought to Brando by the Sentinel cavalry, they were more or less in a sorry state. These people were dressed like the children of the most common country gentry in the empire. They wore thick wool coats, feathered hats and deerskin boots. However, their faces were very determined. Although they were covered in blood and mud, and 2 of them were seriously injured, they did not look afraid or lost. They just looked a little tired. Brando then noticed that these people were all wearing long swords. Although the style of the swords was different and there were all kinds of swords, the way they held the swords was very standard. They did not look like aristocrats, nor did they look like soldiers of the empire. Instead, they looked like knights of the inner court. Brando pondered for a moment and understood the identity of these people. He could not help but think that his Sentinel cavalry was quite lucky to have brought back a few spies from the royal family of Cruz. However, he then felt a little relieved. Only the inner court knights with extraordinary martial arts could survive this sudden attack and survive until now. While Brando was sizing up the inner court knights, he was also sizing up the Count. To be honest, it was not that he did not know him. On the contrary, he was very clear about his identity and origin. He even knew everything that had happened from the Blacksword Fortress to his arrival. In fact, the news of the arrival of the Erewhon envoy was personally sealed in the envelope with the sevenfold flame pattern insignia. Then he stamped it with the seal of the Hillet Villa and sent it to the White Rose Garden. In the previous battle, he thought that he was going to die, but he did not expect to be saved by the crew's cavalry scouts at the last moment. The moment he saw the strangely dressed cavalry, he immediately knew who they were. But he had only heard of the Count's name from rumors before he met him in person. Even he did not expect the leader of the Erewhon envoy to be so young. He was so young that he could not help but have some doubts. How could the Erewhon people be assured to let such a young man be the leader of the envoy? He suddenly understood the reason why the Count had caused a series of troubles before. With this thought in mind, Rogers and a few of his colleagues bowed slightly to Brendel. This was a knight's salute, and it had nothing to do with seniority. It was just to thank Owain for lending them a helping hand. Chapter 920. What is going on here, Count Tonagel? Just as Rogers saluted, Duke Viro's daughter hurried over and stopped when she saw Rogers and the others, apparently recognizing them as Kurlutzians. A puzzled look appeared in her eyes. Although these people were injured, they didn't look like the Count's captives. Brando did not allow them to participate in the battle, so they had been waiting for news from the back. They did not expect Ferlara to be the last one to arrive. The wild elf did not tell them whether they won or lost. She only told them that the Count wanted them to go over. Along the way, Eugenie noticed that there were no signs of battle. She did not see any Cruz's army, and the White Lion Guards did not look like they were involved in a battle. Brando saw the others behind the Duke's daughter. Romaine winked at him to show that she was fine, Avram who looked reluctant, Aiko who was standing with Count Janelace's men, the little girl from the Grenoir's family, Kiera who was staring at the hands of the Cruz's men, and Miss Enid who was beside her. Lastly, Dilfrey, Magadel and Harus. The Baron, who had just arrived, followed behind everyone, maintaining a distance that was neither too close nor too close. He looked at Brendel with a vigilant gaze. Brando did not pay attention to him. Although he knew who the Baron was, he nodded to Ferlara when he saw that all the envoys had arrived. As for Eugenie's question, Brando looked at Rogers and said, "Sir, you have heard the lady's question. You must have guessed that we are Erewhon's envoys. As guests of the Empire, we would like to know what happened. Perhaps you can tell us a thing or two." Rogers' eyes swept across the envoys one by one. He was slightly surprised and said, My lord, we were suddenly attacked by those monsters. We have not figured out what happened." Brando smiled. "Are you locals?" "Yes," replied Rogers at once. "I am Rogers of the House of Warren, and this is Sir Fergus's son," pointing to his tall, curly-haired companion and introducing the knight. "This is Sir Turner's daughter, and he is Mr. Locke's pupil." Lastly, he introduced the young man in the robe. Brando didn't need to listen to him to understand that these were all imaginary identities, but he didn't rush to expose them. Instead, he asked a few more questions about the local area, and Rogers answered them one by one without any doubts. The Duke's daughter looked at them suspiciously. She didn't understand why Brando was interested in these people. She thought they were Earl Jean's people, but she didn't expect them to be the descendants of the local gentry. After listening to Rogers' answer, Brando smiled. "You answered well. That's right." Rogers wanted to say more, but when he heard this, he couldn't help but be stunned. He didn't understand what the other party meant. For a moment, the second half of the sentence was stuck in his throat. Brando replied, "Since Mr. Rogers is so familiar with this place, you must be a knight of the inner court stationed here. Or should I call you Mr. or Madam Spies?" Rogers' eyelids twitched, and he subconsciously put his hand on the hilt of his sword. The man and woman behind him did the same. Only the young man in a long robe, with jet-black hair and pitch-black eyes, remained indifferent. Rogers' hand was just about to touch the hilt of his sword, but he suddenly realized something and slowly let go. He raised his head and smiled bitterly at Brendel. "Count Brendel, you have good eyesight. You recognized us long ago, right?" "You're welcome," Brando replied. These spies were undoubtedly the best gift from Martha. These people were the most important eyes and ears of the royal family of Cruz. Sometimes they even knew the movements of everyone in an area better than the local lords. Moreover, most of the people who were selected to become inner court knights were smart. At this time, if they wanted to find someone to find out what happened in Floating Cloud Hill overnight, it could be said that no one was more suitable than them. This time, his Sentinel cavalry obviously couldn't have done a better job. He continued, Mr. Rogers, since you are an inner court knight stationed here, then I won't beat around the bush. You are more familiar with this place than I am. I think you should have more or less guessed what happened to you. Rogers exchanged glances with his companions. Then he looked at Brando and asked tentatively, I will only admit part of it, but we are not sure yet. The Duke's daughter was curious when she heard that these people were inner court knights of the royal family of Cruz. She couldn't help but look at them curiously. But Brando and this person's riddle was still unbearable. She opened her mouth and said, Maybe I can ask what you were talking about. What happened? Miss Eugenie, if the Count is not wrong, the creatures under Georgindy Ridge may have invaded the Empire. Medisha at this time received Brando's signal and replied softly. Then she repeated Count Jean's experience and some clues they found. This information was not confidential. One could understand it by going to Vargos in person. Georgindy Ridge. Eugenie was shocked. The Duke's daughter was stunned for a moment before she realized what she was talking about. It was obvious that this term had never appeared in her mind, not even in her wildest imagination. The people of the underground and the people of the surface were isolated from each other. They had not interfered with each other for thousands of years. Why would they suddenly invade the surface? Her first reaction was that the Count was bluffing again. But when her eyes fell on Rogers and the others who did not refute, she realized that all of this might be true. She could not help but blurt out, What are they doing here? She had just finished her words when she realized what was going on. She could not help but cover her mouth and said, Lion people. Oh my God, don't tell me they have reunited with the Temple of the Earth after 1,000 years? Roger's face was a little dark. Count, how confident are you? You all know how confident I am. Why ask me? Brando replied. At this time, Enide carefully asked the little girl beside her, Kiara, what are they talking about? Is the Empire in trouble? Big trouble. The little girl, who was still wearing her huge scholar's hat today, smiled gloatingly. If that guy didn't lie, Luokeki, the fortress cluster in Broken Sword Mountain Range will not be in the hands of the Empire for long. Rogers obviously also realized this. When Kuei told him that the communication magic was interfered with, he had a faint premonition in his heart. He knew very well what it was. It was a kind of interception magic on the battlefield. The subterranean dwellers wouldn't have used such spells if it were just a simple attack from monsters. They would only be facing an organized army, and it went without saying who was behind the subterranean dwellers. His expression changed for a moment and he finally made a decision. He first glanced at his companions and then said to Brando, If Georgindy Ridge has indeed attacked the Empire, then this area should have fallen into their hands now. This should be a problem for the Count. Of course, I think the subterranean dwellers can't tell the difference between the Cruz and Erwin. Brando replied. What does the Count plan to do? I have a simple plan. That is to find out where these underground creatures are and find a place to break out of their encirclement, Brendel replied. Their first target is Anzaruta's defensive line, and their second target is the Empire's army. It should be easy for my small group to break out of their encirclement. But I have a more perfect idea. If we can stop these uninvited guests, maybe the situation in the south of the Empire will not become as bad as imagined. Rogers and the three people behind him looked at Brando in surprise and said in a trembling voice, What did you say, Count? Why, is it difficult to understand what I said? No, but... Brendel looked at the flabbergasted internal court knights and could not help but feel a sense of satisfaction from his successful prank. Even the insufferably arrogant people of the Empire had moments when they were confused. This meant that they had all been fooled. On the other hand, the young lady beside Yenid was looking at this scene with a malicious smile. She snorted from time to time. It was unknown who she was mocking for being stupid and shallow. The Duke's daughter suddenly realized something after Kiara's words. She couldn't help but take a deep look at the head envoy. Brando then said, I understand. You think that from my standpoint I should be on the opposing side of the Empire, or at least remain neutral? Rogers did not answer, but the expression on his face was undoubtedly so. The tall man behind him shrugged and looked helpless. The female knight behind them looked a little nervous and her hand was always on the hilt of her sword. Only the last young man did not say a word from beginning to end. His face was calm. Brando looked at the young man again and then said, You have misunderstood something. I am still on the opposite side of some of you, but in this holy war, Erwin's people are still allies of Cruz's people. This will not change. Rogers looked at the Count with a little surprise. He thought that the rumors said that the Count was eccentric, but he did not expect the rumors to be true. In the Count's words, the Empire was the Empire and the nobles were the nobles. It was as if they were two separate concepts. He faintly felt that Brando was implying something, but he did not have time to think about it. He replied with gratitude in his heart, "Count, I admire your integrity very much. Now I believe that what you did in the Black Sword Fortress was as the rumors said. I apologize to you on behalf of the Empire." When Chiara heard this, she quickly pulled Enid and turned around. Her action startled the latter. She could not help but ask in a low voice, "What's wrong, Chiara? Are you not feeling well?" The little girl from Cypher's family had a terrible stomachache. She held back her laughter and replied, "It's nothing. Enid, I'm afraid I'll laugh out loud. Help me block it. I can't stand it anymore." The daughter of the Count of Grey Mountain looked at her companion inexplicably. But Rogers was really grateful at the moment. There were very few people in the world who could separate their love and hate from their principles of conduct. The enmity between Brando and the nobles of the Empire was well known, not to mention that they were preparing for a war before today. But the other party was able to decisively put down his hatred and prejudice at the critical moment. This alone was enough to make him admire him. And this admiration came from the gratitude he had as a soldier of the Empire. He watched the Empire fall into danger and could not do anything. Of course, he was more skeptical about Brando's words, but he did not show it on his face. Brando took in everyone's expression, then shook his head and replied, "What I need now is not an apology. Even if there is an apology, it's not from you but from some arrogant guy. What we need now is to figure out what happened. What we said before is nothing more than speculation based on the existing information, but we still need a more detailed plan. Mr. Rogers, I believe you understand why I want to see you. If I want to know what happened before last night, no one here knows better than you." This was what Brando and Maynold were most concerned about at the moment. Hemlock Town was empty and there were no signs of battle. Only a few residents of Boulevard of Leaves and Vargas were attacked. All signs indicated that the army of Count Alcorn and the other nobles did not retreat because of the attack on Georgandy Ridge. Or at least they might have escaped before that. But what Brando could not figure out was why Count Jean was left alone in this place. In fact, the Count was still cursing his heartless colleagues. Coincidentally, according to the cavalry captain's judgment, the Curlut's inner knights weren't the owners of the farm where the Sentinel cavalry rescued Rogers and the others. In other words, they probably encountered the cavemen halfway and had to retreat to the nearby farm to defend. As for why they left their secret base at that time, it might be a coincidence, but Brando was more inclined to another guess. Rogers was slightly surprised at this moment. Apparently, the Count was very clear about the jurisdiction of the knight, but he was a little puzzled as to why the other party knew so much about them. Even among the upper echelons of the Empire, the Knight of the Imperial Court was only a semi-public existence. Some secrets were only in the hands of the royal family from the beginning to the end. Regarding this point, even the young man in the robe raised his head for the first time. He looked at Brando and lowered his head again. This thought only flashed in Roger's mind and then disappeared. But then a more surprising thought rose in his mind. He could not help but raise his head and look at Brando in confusion. "Count Jean, didn't you see?" "See what?" Brando asked inexplicably. After saying this, he immediately frowned again, instinctively realizing that he and Count Jean might have missed something. Of course, it was also possible that the other party was playing some kind of trick, but when he saw Rogers exchange glances with his colleagues in shock, he knew that the other party was not lying. Rogers seemed to take a while to digest the news. His Adam's apple rolled before he replied dryly, "Count Jean, please forgive my offense. Can I confirm again that you and your delegation did not see that beam of light last night?" His tone was so careful that he unconsciously used honorifics when addressing Brando. Beam of light? Brando was really stunned this time. He and Maynold did not sleep all night, but they did not see any beam of light at all. "What are you talking about? Is there a magic resonance somewhere? Is it a trick of the crypt creatures in Georgandy Ridge?" "It's not a magic resonance," the female knight, who had been silent all this time, blurted out. "It's the resonance of a divine artifact. How could you not see it?" Near Vargas and Linya Avenue, half the sky was illuminated. Almost everyone saw a meteor falling to the ground, and the northern sky seemed to be burning. The two finished speaking at the same time and then fell silent at the same time. Everyone looked at each other. "What are you talking about?" "There's no such thing." The Duke's daughter frowned and retorted. "Meteor falling to the ground? Is there such a fun thing?" Roman's eyes lit up. He hurriedly looked at Medisha, but the latter frowned as if thinking about something. You said the meteor fell to the ground, and the northern sky seemed to be burning? Brando asked as if he had heard a fairy tale. The female knight did not understand what she had said wrong. She looked at her companions, but Roger's and Trevor's faces were very gloomy. What's going on? Rogers asked in a deep voice. My lord, you didn't see this scene? Brando did not answer. He only exchanged a glance with Maynard. The latter nodded silently at him and mouthed a word to him. Brando turned around and seemed to understand something. He said to the White Lion guards beside him, "Go and ask Count Jean if he saw what Mr. Rogers and the others said." In order to avoid going down the same path as Kanan, no matter how difficult it was, he would continue to update and persevere until the end of the game. Chapter 921. Just as Brando expected, Earl Jean and his army entered the area one night in advance. They did not see any meteors or flames in the sky, nor did they see the resonance of the divine artifact. What he saw was no different from what Brando and Maynard saw last night. There was only a river of stars in the sky and a starry sky in the winter night. Now why was the Earl left here alone? It was as if the truth had been revealed. Whether it was Earl Alcon, the Moore family, the Walker family, or the Cooper family, the nobles of Cruz who gathered here reacted the moment they saw the divine artifact. Compared to the divine artifact, what was a mere Earl Erwin? Therefore they rushed to the north at the first opportunity, hoping to be the first to reach the place where the meteors fell. Even if they could not take the divine artifact for themselves as the discoverer, they would be the first to offer it to the supreme existence of the Empire, or the Holy Cathedral of Fire. Then they and the families behind them would share this unimaginable glory. It was not impossible for them to rise to the top in one step. The knight of the inner court who belonged to the royal family was no exception. As the supervisor of Floating Cloud Hills, it was impossible for them to ignore such a big thing happening in this land. In fact, Rogers was very clear about the importance of the divine artifact. Therefore he brought all the inner court knight in Hillet Villa to prevent the nobles from doing anything irrational. But the problem was, Earl Jean did not see it. He did not know what was happening less than 20 miles away in the area of Valgus and Forest Leaf Avenue. He was scouting the battlefield with his subordinates under the night sky and occupied the advantageous terrain. So, everything that happened after that night could be explained. Roger's face was a little ugly. He was sure that the strange scene last night should be clearly visible at least 100 miles away, not to mention the hilly area close to Forest Leaf Avenue and Valgus. Could it be? The female knight seemed to have realized something. This is a trap set by Georgindy Ridge? A large-scale illusion. That was the first thing that came to Roger's mind. But when he and Frater looked back at the black-haired young man, the latter shook his head with certainty. That's the resonance of the divine artifact. The young man answered affirmatively, and then said no more, as if it was none of his business whether you believed it or not. Kuei, this doesn't make sense. Trevor said, well, I know you're the best, but the problem is that you're still young. You have to admit that there are a lot of old guys in this world who are much stronger than you. It's not a big deal to lose to them. Before he could finish speaking, he saw the young man glancing at him indifferently, causing the latter half of his sentence to be stuck in his throat. He could only spread out his hands and say, all right, pretend I didn't say anything. Before Trevor could finish speaking, he heard a soft sneer. How pitiful. Stupid people who don't know themselves. The internal court knight's expression changed abruptly. He raised his head and looked in that direction, only to find a short little girl looking at him contemptuously with her chin raised. Trevor was almost angered to death. He wanted to flare up, but then he remembered that as an imperial knight, it seemed undignified to scare a little girl. He could only pout and say, forget it. I'm not going to argue with an uneducated little girl. But what he did not expect was that the little girl dared to snort softly and replied with disdain, shut up. Brainless people have no right to speak. The law of the divine artifact is the superior law, and the law of magic is the inferior law. The superior law can simulate the power of the inferior law, but this process is irreversible. This is also the basic principle of the Tiamat canon. Otherwise, what's the difference between the resonance of magic and the reaction of the divine artifact? You don't even know this. You're not fit to be a human. Chiara shook her head in disappointment. This little lady from House Cypher had a childish voice, but her words were clear and logical, giving people a strange feeling of contrast. But to Trevor, it sounded like slaps to the left and right of his face, making it swell. Even though he did not understand most of it. In the end, the little lady concluded crisply, apologize to your companions. Because you've insulted knowledge. If I have any sense of shame, I'll choose to kill myself by slamming my head against that red pine tree over there. Do you know why? She snorted softly. Because the red pine tree is called the Tree of Fools by the mountain people. This title was prepared for your excellency thousands of years later. Trevor was dumbfounded, but even his companions behind him could not help but snicker. If Erwin's people were to provoke them verbally, they would naturally defend their companions. But the problem was that the one who spoke was just a child. Who would argue with a little girl? The black-haired young man could not help but look at Kiara a few more times. The female knight patted the tall companion's shoulder sympathetically. Trevor, back in Inor, who was the one who said that as long as one passed the swordsmanship class, one could graduate? The internal court knight's face was bitter. He regretted it so much that his intestines were turning green. Of course, what he regretted was not what he said back then, but that he should not have provoked this sharp-tongued little lady. Brando knew how terrifying this sister of the king's eldest son was. He only found out later that her mentor was Zazian. That guy was an old friend of Tuman's, the master of ancient Erewhon linguistics in this era, and an important storyline NPC during the Slate War. He had seen the kind-looking little old man before, but he had never seen Chiara before. He didn't know how the old man had pampered the genius girl of House Cypher to the point that she had developed the personality of a little witch. He did not want to provoke Chiara because he knew that the other party was still thinking about his knowledge of the Bugas. So he changed the topic. Mr. Rogers, let me ask you a question. Before the resonance of the divine artifact occurred, did anything unusual happen in Vargas, Linia Avenue, and even Ironwood Town? Rogers glanced at Brando and instinctively felt that the other party did not seem to want to mention the meteor fall. But he quickly put this vague premonition behind him and thought carefully. The resonance of the divine artifact occurred after 9 o'clock. Before that, it was very calm. Most of the nobles did not leave their stations, except for Count Jean, who set off from Linia Avenue in advance and went to this place. He looked at Brando's eyes and continued to answer. In fact, until our spies sent the last message before evening, it should have been relatively normal. Did your spies contact you after that? You should be using magic to communicate, right? Brando knew that these internal knights were mainly in charge, but they should have a lot of spies outside. My lord, the magic communication in the entire area has been interfered with by someone using magic, Rogers replied. Brando was slightly stunned, but then he understood. Dimensional anchor and suppression spells were not rare in Wond, and the underground army of Georgiandy Ridge obviously had the ability to cast these spells to cover the entire area. The Nest Lords and the Blind Shamans were very good spellcasters. He wanted to ask more, but he saw that the female knight wanted to say something but stopped. Then she whispered something to Rogers and the latter nodded. She then plucked up the courage to answer. My lord, there's one more thing. Please go ahead. Before the resonance of the divine artifact occurred, there was a very long period of time where the entire Vargas region could hear very ear-piercing vibrations. The sound should have come from above the clouds, the female knight replied. Brando slapped his forehead. He had never heard this sound before. He thought for a moment and asked, does it sound like the sound of a fleet passing through the clouds? The officer from Yanalasu raised his head sharply and looked at Brando curiously. The floating ship was still a new weapon in this era, and not many people were familiar with it. However, the female knight shook her head. That sounds more like thunder. It's rumbling. Brando exchanged glances with Maynard again, and then continued to ask, you met the caveman halfway, right? When was that? Early in the morning, Rogers replied with certainty. Brando pondered for a moment. Well, let's assume that all of this is a conspiracy of the Georgiandy Ridge people. Mr. Rogers, do you know of any natural entrances to the underground in this area? I know of one near Hemlock Town. The tall knight replied. I wanted to explore it once. It's terrifyingly big, but unfortunately I didn't go very deep. Is it very dark inside, Mr. Knight? A crisp voice asked. The inner court knight looked over and found that it was another little lowly asking him a question. He quickly shut his mouth and did not say a word, as if the little Lolas from Aween were all demons with horns on their heads. The one who spoke to him was naturally the daughter of the Grand Duke of Grinoires, but the little lowly did not expect Trevor to quickly put on a straight face when he heard her speak. He even glared at her, scaring the little girl to tears. There's also one near Forest Leaf Avenue, Rogers replied. Brando thought for a moment. It was almost the same as what he remembered. He then looked at Maynard and the latter nodded. That means that when you encountered the subterranean dwellers, It was less than an hour before Georgandy Ridge launched their attack. He thought for a moment and replied. Then he turned to Medisha and said, "Bring us our map." Medisha smiled and nodded. "The Underdark dwellers are cunning, especially the Minotaurs and Harpies. They rarely fight unprepared battles, and they must have figured out your deployment before launching a surprise attack. Other than Count Jean, we have not found any other noble's army, and that's why we have not found any traces of the other noble's army. That's why we have not found any traces of the other noble's army, and that's very telling. Your stronghold in Hillet Mountain Manor is no secret. They must have been watching you for a long time. From the underground exit of Leaf Avenue to the farm where you encountered them, according to the speed of the subterranean dwellers, it's almost an hour's journey." Rogers and the others were knights of the inner court. Their task was to monitor the movements of the local nobles, not to be in charge of defense, so it was not surprising that they did not understand these things. That was why Brando patiently explained. If the knight of the Folded Sword Knight Regiment could not even see these things here, then Brando would most likely think that this guy was a liar who deceived the world. "Then what should we do now, Count?" After listening to Brando's analysis, Rogers seemed to have some confidence in the Count of Erewhon, so he asked. Brando did not answer him directly. Instead, he waited for Medisha to bring the map. Rogers and the others could understand the map, but they were clueless about how to infer the movements of an army. And most of Brando's tactical knowledge was inherited from the original memory of this soul. The militia would teach him some superficial knowledge of the map. In his previous life, he had been the leader of a player's adventurer group and mercenary group, presiding over local defense, so he barely understood some scraps of military knowledge. In addition, in this life he had commanded several large and small battles, so he could barely judge the intention of Georgandy Ridge's attack. But the most professional of all was obviously Maynard. The female knight was a graduate of the Royal Knight Academy, a standard academic. She glanced at the map and said to Brando, "The nearest place to Floating Cloud Hill is too far away from Rokizi Broken Sword Mountain Fortress. There are more than 2 entrances to the underground world from here. If they want to attack the fortress from behind, there is no need for them to enter the surface world from here. That is to say, if Georgandy Ridge has indeed formed an alliance with Toquinen, then the army in front of us is probably not the main force?" Chiara asked at this time. "This is a harassment force," Brando replied while looking at the map. "Their goal is to prevent the Imperial army from gathering in the hinterland behind the fortress." His eyes looked across Hemlock Town, Vargas and Linia Avenue. To achieve this goal, they must attack the most critical points. Both his and Maynard's eyes fell on a town at the same time. North of Anzaruta, between the mountains and the dotted towns, it was undoubtedly the most dazzling star. The city was called the White City of Cruz. Compared with the White City of Fanzan, except that both cities were built with the same white stone walls, another thing in common was that they were important land transportation hubs. Azaf was the southern terminus of the Evergreen Corridor, which was connected to the central region of the empire. To the north was the Flowerleaf Ridge, to the east was the Wilderness of the Four Territories, and to the west was the heartland of the empire, the plains north of Violet Valley. Once this city fell, it meant that the entire southern part of the empire, from Rokizi to Anzaruta, and then to the Wilderness of the Four Territories, would collapse. Although Rogers and the others did not understand the strategic intentions of the army of Georgandy Ridge, they still understood the importance of Azaf. Seeing Brando and Maynard's eyes fall on this point on the map, several Imperial Knights' faces turned pale. Obviously, they knew what kind of situation the Empire would face if the rats from the underground succeeded. But Brendel was not that nervous. First of all, it had nothing to do with him, and second of all, he knew that the situation was not that bad. The eagle above the Kurlutz Highlands was an eagle after all. How could it be defeated by a sneak attack? Azaf's geographical location was so important that there were powerful local legions in all 4 directions, not to mention the Imperial Navy stationed in the west of Rokizi. If the harassment force of Georgandy Ridge could take down Azaf, then they would not just be a harassment force but the main force. The intention of this force was obviously to attract the attention of these local legions so that they would not have time to rescue Rokizi. If this rat really achieved its goal, even if it only reached the vicinity of Azaf, it would basically announce the end of the Empire's line of defense in Anzaruta. Just such a blow was absolutely unacceptable to the Empire. Brando's eyes moved back and fell on the north of Vargas and Linia Avenue. Ironwood Town, crossing Vargas and Linia Avenue is not their goal. They should have crossed these places earlier today, Maynard replied. Brendel nodded in agreement, and the results of the investigation also confirmed this judgment. He stared at the map in silence, but several of the Kurlut's knights seemed a little anxious, as if they were one step slower and the empire would fall into an irrecoverable situation in the blink of an eye. Brando seemed to be aware of the obvious anxiety of the knights. He deliberately looked at them. Rogers finally could not help but ask, "Count, I wonder if what you said before is true or false?" "What?" Brando pretended to be ignorant and asked in return. Chiara looked at the conversation between the two with interest. Rogers licked his lips and then replied, "My lord, you said that there is a more perfect idea. If we can stop these uninvited guests, maybe the situation in the south of the empire will not become as bad as imagined." Brando seemed to remember this sentence. He nodded and said, "My army is here. If the Georgiandy Ridge's harassment force is a whole legion, then do you think we can defeat them?" Rogers thought for a moment and shook his head. "Then if all of us here fight to the death at the cost of everyone's life, we can delay the Georgiandy Ridge's pace. Do you think we can do that?" Brando asked again. Rogers showed a hesitant look on his face, then shook his head a little heavily. "Count, although you are an ally of the Empire has no right to ask you to make such a sacrifice." Brando looked at this guy in surprise, thinking that this guy actually had some knight spirit, but he did not know if he was forced to say so. He shook his head and replied, "Then if I tell you that I may have a way to do what I said above, would you believe me?" Rogers had no hope at all. His only hope now was to break out with the Count and then send a message to His Majesty in the shortest time possible. But when he heard Brando's question, he could not help but be stunned for a moment. He looked up in disbelief and asked, "Count, what did you say? Why, is it difficult to understand what I said?" Brando replied with the original sentence. "No, but..." Rogers still wanted to say something, but Brando interrupted him. "This is not a question of yes or no. I only have one request, and that is to follow my orders. You also know that it is impossible for us to shake the army of Georgiandy Ridge, so I must get your help. Of course, if you are unwilling to accept the command of an Erewhon, then we will choose the first option." Rogers and his companions looked at each other, and the internal knight immediately nodded. "I understand, Count. What do you want us to do?" Brando glanced at the red pine forest. "It's very simple. You first go and persuade Count Jean to join us. He has more than 1,000 men under him. We can't just let them disband on the spot, right?" Chapter 922. The news of Georgiandy Ridge's invasion of the Empire was a little too shocking, and everyone needed some time to digest it. After the 4 knights of the internal court left, the others also dispersed. Medisha, the Shire, and the others had to prepare for the battle that they might face next. The other members of the diplomatic group each had their own thoughts, and they were all persuaded by Brando to go back. In the end, only Yuta stayed by his side. The female mercenary captain was the nominal commander of the White Lion Guards that accompanied the diplomatic group, and she needed to stay and wait for Brando's orders. But other than that, there were also 2 uninvited guests. Chiara did not treat them as outsiders and still stayed by the side with interest. The Duke's daughter also did not seem to have any intention of leaving. After everyone left, Chiara asked, "Hey, what are you planning?" Brando glanced at the little girl. "What are you staying here for?" "Why can't I stay here?" Chiara said, "You haven't answered my question yet." "Of course it's to solve the problem. Didn't I say so earlier?" "Humph, I can guess even if you don't say it," the little girl replied proudly. "But are you really going to stand on the side of the Cruz people?" She looked at Brando curiously. Because of her rare Cruz blood, her eyes were a natural light blue and transparent like glass. "Now that we have common interests, why can't I?" Brando replied. "That's true, but it's a little inconsistent with your style of doing things." Brando found it funny and could not help but deliberately tease her. "Miss Chiara, I've only been with you for less than a month and I spent most of my time hiding in the carriage. How do you know my style of doing things so well?" Chiara glanced at the Duke's daughter, arbitrary and self-opinionated. "Stop." Brando saw the Duke's daughter's mouth moving as if she wanted to say something, so he quickly stopped her. He was already having a headache. Chiara giggled. "What's wrong?" "Although I don't know why, I always feel that you hate the people of the Empire. At least you won't say those righteous words. Loyal allies of the Empire, this kind of thing is just talk among the other nobles. I don't believe your nonsense." Brendel looked at the little girl from House Cypher in surprise. She was not much older than Duke Grenoire's daughter, but one of them looked like an adult while the other looked like a real lowly. Of course, Kiera still had the childishness of a young girl, but compared to Cypher, it was like the difference between heaven and earth. He did not expect that she had been observing him all this time, and even accurately described his state of mind. If the person who spoke was someone familiar with him, or someone with keen observation skills like his senior sister, he would not be surprised at all. But the person who spoke was a little girl. "What's wrong? Scared?" Chiara looked at him. "Actually, it's not a big deal. Your shrewdness is written all over your face. It's not difficult at all. In fact, I know a lot of things. How about it, do you want to make a deal with me?" She looked at Brando and replied confidently, "You definitely didn't come to the Empire for the Holy War, at least not only that. You don't have to lie to me, I won't believe you. In short, what you're going to do is going to be very troublesome, and although you have a good judgment of the general trend, your brain is too slow. When playing chess, the layout and the ending are equally important, and the latter is often the deciding factor of success or failure. If you ask me, maybe I'll be kind enough to help you." Brando looked at the egomaniac. "Then I really have to thank you." "Actually, you don't have to. I can see that you're very stubborn. You definitely can't bring yourself to beg me," Chiara said again, "but we can make a deal. Why don't you tell me the inheritance of the Buga's knowledge, and I'll help you come up with a plan." Brando looked at the little loli revealing her foxtail and could not help but shake his head. This was not the first time. It seemed that she was determined to get his illusory knowledge of the Bugas. But now he was not in the mood to tell this little girl bedtime stories, so he just replied casually, "The knowledge of the Bugas can't be explained in a short time. Their knowledge is recorded in the scrolls and can fill the White Tower. I'm afraid that when we leave the Empire, I won't even finish telling you the beginning. A deal is about fairness and I won't do an unfair deal." "It doesn't matter." Chiara blurted out, "Anyway, I'm going to stay at your place for a long time." Brando looked at the little girl inexplicably. The little loli patted her cheek gently and quickly corrected herself. "I mean, I can stay at your place for a while. Why don't you welcome a lady as a guest?" Brando looked at the little girl from head to toe, but he could not see how this egomaniac was related to a lady. At this time, a real lady, the daughter of the Grand Duke Viro, finally got the chance to interrupt the meaningless conversation between the two and asked, "Count, did you already know about Georgiandy Ridge?" "What is it?" Brando noticed the suspicious look in the Duke's daughter's eyes and was slightly taken aback. "Everything that's happening right now, did you already know about it?" The Duke's daughter stared at Brando. She had been wanting to ask this question since the beginning. When Brando, Rogers, and the others said those words, she remembered Brando's promise. Although he had a bad relationship with Cruz before, if he could really save the situation at this time, what he had done before would not bring him any trouble. Instead, it would become his glorious emblem. A noble who would neither yield to the power of the Empire nor abandon justice because of personal grudges, and who could distinguish right from wrong, coupled with his performance in this war, one could imagine how high his prestige and reputation would be in both the Empire and the kingdom. But what made the Duke's daughter feel a little scared was, how did he guess all this? How did he expect the attack of Georgiandy Ridge? How did he expect the Empire to be in trouble? If this was a prearranged arrangement, then it would be a little too scary. Brando glanced at Eugenie as if he knew what she was thinking. He nodded and said, "Yes, Miss Eugenie. In fact, I contacted Georgiandy Ridge and asked the people of the Underdark to form an alliance with the Lion Men of Toquinin, and then ordered them to attack the Empire. You know, I have a Haurangaya. Although it's broken, it can still be used. I've seen them in the loop of trade winds before. They cried and asked me to be their chieftain, and they even said that they wanted to marry their saintess to me. But I refused righteously because of the principle that different species should not intermarry. By the way, have you seen their saintess?" The Duke's daughter stared at the Count with her eyes wide open, but the more she listened, the more ridiculous it became. Finally, she realized that he was just teasing her. "You." She could only snort, knowing that this guy would never tell her the truth. When Yuta heard Brando talking about the saintess of the Lion Men, she finally could not help but laugh. She thought that her lord was too playful. If those words were to reach the ears of the Lion Men, Toquinin's enemy tomorrow would not be the Empire, but Erwin's new leader of the diplomatic corps. Her laughter attracted Brando's attention. He had never seen his beautiful mercenary commander like this before. Yuta almost immediately realized that she had lost her composure. She quickly composed herself and lowered her head to complain to her lord. Although Brando's words were absurd, he did not deny Eugenie's doubts. The Duke's daughter thought for a moment and understood the meaning behind it. She had been in fear these days, and although the current situation seemed to be getting worse, she more or less saw a glimmer of hope. At least it seemed that their leader was not so unreliable. Many people said that he was crazy, but how many people expected this day to come? She was silent for a moment, and seemed to have gained a little confidence. "Count, what you said to the people of Cruz, is it true?" "I said a lot to them, and it's inevitable that there are some lies," Brando replied. "But which part are you asking about?" The Duke's daughter rolled her eyes at him. "You said that you can save the situation. Aren't you kidding?" "Not all of it," Brando replied. "Miss Eugenie, this is the beginning of a great war. In this war there are very few things that we can control. Seriously speaking, at least until now, with or without us, the outcome of this war will not change much." The Duke's daughter widened her eyes again. She knew diplomatic etiquette, but she knew nothing about military matters. "But you still said that to them?" Chiara listened to the conversation between the two and could not help but laugh. "Miss Eugenie," she replied, "this is the cunning part of this guy. In a war, any factor will have an impact on the outcome of the war, but the key is the extent of the impact. Of course he can save the situation, but the key is to what extent. This is not easy to say. No one is a god in heaven who can guarantee this kind of thing." "So you are lying to them?" The Duke's daughter felt that she had to take back her previous thoughts. They were the knight of the inner court of the empire, the secret agent of the royal family. What was the difference between lying in front of the supreme of the empire? "You can't say that I am lying. We can indeed leave. I just thought of a way to give them a little confidence. After all, it is their duty to protect the empire, not ours. We stayed to help them. We have done our best." Brando replied. "Don't worry. No one knows how bad the situation will be in the end or how good it will be in the end. We do not need to defeat Georgiandy Ridge, but we just need to do better than others. As for what will happen when the time comes, it depends on what we say." The Duke's daughter finally had a clue. This seemed to be no different from diplomatic affairs because they were all equally shameless. "My lord, what do you plan to do next? Will the diplomatic group be in danger?" she asked the Duke's daughter. Brando shook his head this time. He could not answer this question. As Maynard said, history had pulled everyone back to the same starting line. The participation of Georgiandy Ridge had completely changed the history he knew. Georgiandy Ridge was not a country in the true sense. Perhaps it could only be called a country. It was a general term for the underworld. In the dark underworld, there were only lords, castellans, patriarchs, and different ethnic groups gathered together to form scattered forces of various sizes. He still did not know which lord or lords had contacted the Toquinen lion beastmen, but Brando had a vague hunch that this invasion was not simple. The power structure of Georgiandy Ridge had determined that its lords rarely launched large-scale military operations, but if the current situation was as he expected, then it was a rare move in the underground world. It was very likely that it did not only include the actions of a few lords, but Brendel felt that this idea was a little too ridiculous, and even he could not accept it. There was a thick fog in front of him that was waiting for him to clear up. His knowledge of history was quietly disintegrating, and all that was left for him was the experience of 2 lifetimes. "I have a vague idea, but I need to confirm it first. Before that, we need to minimize our conflicts with them, but we still need to focus on breaking through their encirclement. If we accidentally fall into their encirclement, we won't be able to do anything." Brendel replied in a low voice. "Break out?" the Duke's daughter asked. "Which direction should we break out in?" "It's best to break out in the direction of the inland sea." "The inland sea?" Brando nodded. The snow on the mountains of Anzaruta melted and formed rivers. These rivers flowed westward through many duchies and into the Sea of the Dying Moon. They flowed southward into Erewhon and finally into the Shining Sea. The rivers flowed northward into the inland rivers. These rivers flowed north of Anzaruta and gradually washed out a hilly area, which was today's Floating Cloud Hills. One of the most famous rivers was the Surging Silver River. The Surging Silver River crossed Anzaruta and opened up the Surging Silver Valley. The southern part of the valley was called the Vargas region, which included Vargas, Hemlock Town and other towns of various sizes. North of the valley was the Bear Lake region. The river formed a lake on the hills and then turned eastward under the obstruction of the short main mountains and entered a huge inland lake. This lake was the inland sea that Brando mentioned, the Empire's Inland Sea. The Empire's Inland Sea was also known as the Sublime Inland Sea. It was a huge inland lake, but it spanned across dozens of regions. The lake water was also very salty, so it was not an exaggeration to call it a sea. The Sublime Inland Sea started from the Cape Bay in the west, the Metz region in the north, the short main mountains in the east, close to the Evergreen Corridor, and the end of the Rokisi Plateau in the south, a rich alluvial plain. The entire Sublime Inland Sea almost divided the empire from east to west and from south to north, but it gave birth to the most glorious civilization of the Cruz people. Countless ports and cities were located along the coast, closely connecting this huge empire for the past 1,000 years. In the long river of time, the entire sublime inland sea had become the most prosperous and elite region of the empire. The continuous southern plains, the prosperous Cape Bay, the hometown of shipbuilding, and the heartland of the empire, the Violet Valley. It could even be said that if the entire empire was a sophisticated magical machine, the sublime inland sea would be the magic core of this machine. It provided the empire with an endless supply of power and energy, materials, manpower, and money. Even the orders from the central government of the empire were transmitted through the sublime inland sea to every corner of the empire. The sublime inland sea, on the west of floating cloud hills, revealed a corner of the estuary of the surging Milky Way. Brando knew that there was a port called Lone there. This port was not famous, but it was north and south of Asgard on the south of the Evergreen Corridor. If Asgard fell, then this port would be the last springboard for the Empire to counterattack Enslova in the future. Of course, Jorgendi Ridge would not let go of this port, but the problem was that Brando was sure that the enemy's attack focus would definitely be on Asgard and not Lone. This was because there were many local legions stationed in the Violet Valley on the west of the Evergreen Corridor and the Flower Ridge on the north, not to mention the Red Legion in the Wilderness of Four Realms. If they could not take down Asgard in the shortest time possible, then even if the Golden Mane Lion Mane Beastmen of Toquinen captured the Rokizi Broken Sword Mountain defense line, they would be blocked by the Empire's legions from all directions. By then, if they wanted to take down Asgard, they would have to pay a terrible price. On the other hand, after taking down Asgard, attacking the small port of Lone would be like catching a turtle in a jar. By then, even if crews reacted, it would be impossible for the Violet Valley's army to swim across the sublime inland sea to support Lone, right? When Lone fell, the Empire's navy would lose its landing point, and the center of the war could only return to Asgard. The Empire would have to break through by land, which was obviously what the people of Jorgendi Ridge wanted to see the most. The Duke's daughter seemed to understand Brando's thoughts, but her eyes fell on the map. From Vargos to Lone, there were at least 3 regions in between. This journey would obviously not be too smooth, and they did not have to go through any kind of breakout. This road is not easy to take. Unlike the Duke's daughter who was silent, Kiara asked directly, "Jorgendi Ridge is already ahead of us. Are you confident that you can break through their blockade?" Brando shook his head gently. Confidence was based on confirmed information, but at this moment, all they could do was wait. He believed that soon the exact news would be sent back. From Vargos to the Bear Lake area, where the army of Jorgendi Ridge had advanced in a day, whether the Imperial army stationed there, especially the private armies of the nobles, had resisted, or even if they had escaped, where had they escaped to? This was all the information he needed. Chapter 923. The 4 knights were still trying to persuade Count Jean. Count Jean obviously didn't believe in the invasion of Jorgendi Ridge, just like how Rogers and the others wouldn't believe that the underground army of Jorgendi Ridge would suddenly appear on the surface if they didn't see it with their own eyes. The world under the beehive was too far away for them after all. The cavemen and the minotaurs in the labyrinth were all terrifying creatures in bedtime stories. Although he couldn't explain the disappearance of his allies, he could only assume that it was Brando's private conspiracy, but he couldn't see through it. However, whether he was willing or not, Brando's so-called persuasion was more of a threat than a suggestion. In the end, he had no choice but to hand over the command unwillingly. The setting sun slowly sank into the mountains to the west. The entire hilly region seemed to have sunk into a strange silence. The lights of Valgus could no longer be seen in the silver-gushing valley to the north. The horizon was pitch black. After the hilly region quieted down, the silence made one's hair stand on end. The 4 knights walked silently on the edge of the red pine forest. After walking for a while, the female knight Nasha finally couldn't help but say, "Maybe Count Jean is right. The situation isn't that bad. Maybe it's just a group of bandits from Jorgendi Ridge on the surface. Things like this happen often, don't they?" Rogers frowned and didn't answer. "Then how do you explain the strange light beams and meteors we saw last night?" "Also, 'cause communication magic was disrupted. This was a premeditated attack." Trevor shook his head. "Count Jean is just unwilling to bow down to Erwin. You and I both know that the nobles in these places have always been stubborn and prideful." Nasha was silent for a moment as if she wanted to find a reason to refute but couldn't convince herself. In the end she asked worriedly, "If Jorgendi Ridge really invades us, how bad will it be for the Empire?" "It depends on the scale of Jorgendi Ridge's invasion," Rogers answered in a deep voice. "How big do you think this invasion will be? Can they really threaten the southern defense line of the Empire?" Nasha asked in disbelief. No one seemed to be able to answer this question. They more or less felt that Brando was being an alarmist, but Rogers and Trevor were not familiar with the Forgotten Kingdom underground. In fact, it was rare for the average person to even recognize the entire subterranean ethnic group. Rogers and Trevor suddenly thought of something and turned their eyes to the black-haired youth in a robe. Kuei replied calmly, Georgiandy Ridge is slightly different from us. They don't have a unified kingdom. There are only lords of various sizes in the dark underground. The only exception is the Dark Elves. Kuei, how strong is the strongest overlord? Nasha asked. It's roughly equivalent to a mid-tier kingdom on the surface. Are there many lords like this? Kuei shook his head. Other than the 3 black dragons that were exiled by the Dragon Clan, there are also the famous Minotaur King Geralt and Medusa's Queen Prytana. They are known as the kings of the underground world. If we're talking about threatening the southern defense line of the Empire, is a lord like this strong enough? Nasha asked again. If they go all out, it might be enough. However, the war in the underground world rarely goes all out because they have to guard against enemies in the dark. It's a reasonable guess that 2 overlords are working together, but these overlords are second to none in Georgiandy Ridge. They rarely come to the surface, which is also unknown to them. If it's not for these kings of the underground, it would take 10 or even 20 overlords to launch a war of this scale. Kuei, how likely do you think it is? Trevor turned back and asked. It's hard to say. The underground world is a world that believes in the laws of darkness. Deception is the norm in the dark. They rarely trust each other, let alone form an alliance. Kuei replied. Nasha looked at her companion with some admiration. Then, is it possible for them to form an alliance under special circumstances? Maybe, Kuei replied. But I'm not sure. The Tanajil Count might know more about the people of the underground world. Why do you say that? Maybe he's just being an alarmist? The female knight was obviously not happy to hear that. The black-haired youth replied. He and the female knight beside him are fast and confident in their judgment of the movements of Georgiandy Ridge's army. I can't do that. Trevor felt that his companion's words were a little exaggerated. He shook his head. Although Kuei had a genius mind, he was slightly worse when it came to dealing with people. He knew very well that the Erewhon people could be faking it. When he heard Nasha's question, his heart was a little shaken. Could Georgiandy Ridge really pull out an army of a dozen overlords to cause trouble for the Empire? The Empire was indestructible in the hearts of its people. It might be unlucky for a while, but it was impossible for it to coincidentally encounter the worst situation. Trevor couldn't even imagine that Rokizi, the Broken Sword Mountain Range, would be threatened. It wasn't just 1 or 2 fortresses, but a well-equipped defense line that was nearly 100 miles deep. He vaguely agreed with the female knight's statement. Perhaps the enemy in front of them was just an army of bandits that came from the underground world to the surface world. They might be formed by the army of 1 or 2 overlords who were bribed by the Lion Beastmen. They came to the Empire to cause trouble, distract the attention of the Empire's army, and take the opportunity to plunder. Just as he was thinking about this, Rogers suddenly asked, Kuei, how strong would the power of the entire Georgiandy Ridge be if they were to join forces? The black-haired youth suddenly raised his head and looked at his companion who had been frowning. For the first time, there was an inexplicable expression on his face. That's impossible, he replied. Although Trevor and Nasha both hoped that Georgiandy Ridge's invasion of the Empire was just a private action of 1 or 2 overlords, what was happening in the south of Ruzaf, at the end of the Rokizi Highland, was obviously going against their wishes. There was once a majestic fortress at the mountain pass, but now only rubble and debris were left. The whole fortress seemed to have been hit by a terrible force from the front. The originally intact wall had a huge gap in it. The gap was bathed in the moonlight, and the whole section looked like it had been burned by fire. Even the bricks were carbonized black, and the gravel was sparkling. It was the crystallized gravel. Such scenes were scattered all over the fortress. In addition to the lifeless dead objects, there were also charred and twisted corpses of animals. Cows, horses, donkeys, and even a huge drake that was almost burned into a skeleton. It leaned empty against the side of a house on the street that was also burned into a frame structure. There was no sign of it struggling. It reminded people of the moment when death came, when the extremely high temperature instantly turned this behemoth into ashes from its body to its soul. But it was not just animals. Human corpses were also everywhere. Some of them were wearing armor, but now they had melted and solidified into a metal solution. Some of them were just civilians, but whether it was the elderly or children, men or women, they were all turned into unrecognizable charcoal. Such corpses were scattered all over the street. Their positions indicated that they were hiding from something when they were alive. But time stopped at the last moment. The entire fortress seemed to have been plowed through from the middle. The streets and buildings in these areas were in shambles, but the other districts were still intact. However, the streets and the hillsides on both sides were filled with sharp wooden stakes. Countless human corpses were impaled on these stakes. The corpses stared blankly at the dark sky. The sky was covered with dark clouds, and their eyes had long lost their vitality. The broken fortress became a dead city. There were no Cruz people and there were no enemies. It was as if the Grim Reaper had passed by and quietly took away all the lives. This scene was not the only one in the entire Rokizi Highland, east of Broken Sword Mountains. It was happening in many places at the same time. This was Fort Parcillion, the Empire's Rokizi. Although the Broken Sword Mountains consisted of thousands of forts, checkpoints, and fortresses, only Emerald Claw Fort, Fort Elno, and Fort Parcillion were the real core of the defensive line. The other fortresses were built around them to protect them. Fort Parcillion was the last checkpoint of the defensive line in the direction of the Empire. In thousands of years of history, it had never been breached or even attacked. But today, an army that the Cruz people had never encountered before had changed the course of history. When Ferris woke up from the ruins, he still could not forget the most unforgettable scene of his life. He remembered that the fortress was attacked by a group of harpies. The highest commander of the fortress believed that it was a monster attack. Perhaps there was a new nest somewhere near the fortress. Such things often happened in the border areas. The desolate Rokizi Highland was originally a place where monsters roamed. The Imperial soldiers were not surprised to join the battle. As an Imperial crossbowman, Ferris naturally had to participate in the battle, but he was relatively safe in the shooting room with the others. Although the noise on the city wall was somewhat unbearable, and the creaking sound of the heavy weapons being pushed to the back of the battlements by the militiamen was also unbearable, at that time he used the winch of the heavy crossbow to draw the string, put the bolt in, and then walked to the shooting hole to observe the situation outside. Then, at that moment, he seemed to hear a shrill scream coming from the wall. The sound seemed to fall from the sky, but it also sounded like the cry of a ghost in the middle of the night. The shrill scream made his hair stand on end. Then he saw a huge, cold, emotionless eye through the shooting room. That eye, with just one look, made him feel as if he had fallen into the abyss. A bone-chilling chill seemed to rise from the bottom of his feet, freezing him there. Although he opened his mouth to scream, no sound came out. He vaguely heard the terrified screams of his colleagues on the wall. The screams merged into a buzzing sound as if they were describing a monster that terrified them. But before Ferris could hear what it was, the ground shook. He saw the walls of the shooting room collapse toward him. After the ground beneath his feet disappeared, the world fell into darkness. When Ferris woke up again, he realized that it was the collapsed bricks that saved his life. He lay in the darkness for an unknown amount of time before he regained a little strength. Then, ignoring the soreness all over his body, he gritted his teeth and opened a path through the rubble. As if miraculously, he found that he was not seriously injured. Other than the dull pain when he breathed, which made him suspect that he had broken one or two ribs, his hands and feet were very nimble. There were only abrasions. He used his hands and feet to climb out of the rubble. The next moment, the miserable scene in the fortress reflected in his eyes. Ferris instantly clenched his teeth. Everything in front of him seemed to have appeared in his dreams. Although he had expected it, he still could not help but tremble. He raised his head and looked in the direction of the mountain pass. That was the direction where the monster army had disappeared. From there was the mountain path leading to Emerald Claw Fortress. Behind it was Luo Keki, the heart of the Broken Sword Mountain Ranges fortress group. His heart was cold. He had realized that this was not a monster attack at all, but a premeditated surprise attack. That eye? Ferris trembled as he recalled the scene he had seen. He seemed to want to convince himself that it was just an illusion, but the real fear lurking in his heart reminded him what it was. That was a dragon, a black dragon. There was a saying in the Cruz Empire, "Every day in the Empire is calm, but every day in the Empire is treacherous." This sentence may not be appropriate to describe the entire Cruz Empire, but it was most appropriate to describe the imperial city of Rushta. Since 3 days ago, the White Rose Garden was shrouded in an oppressive atmosphere. The sacred Cantilever Palace was lifeless, as if everyone who walked in would be tainted with bad luck. In the past, this usually meant that Her Majesty's mood had changed again. Generally speaking, there were many factors that caused Her Majesty to be angry. For example, a certain noble caused her displeasure or disappointed her. For example, the Holy Cathedral of Fire and Her Majesty often offended each other. This was a fact that everyone knew. But in addition to the above two main reasons, there were also some minor side events. For example, the mountain people and Zaruda or other barbarians killed the tax collector of the empire. Or, several Grand Dukes who were married to the royal family sent people to one of Her Majesty's banquets. The relationship between the Silver Queen and these relatives of the empire was extremely bad. This was recognized by the whole empire. In fact, there were some new names recently. For example, a certain count from Erewhon was said to have become a thorn in Her Majesty's side. There were also rumors about the female mountain people countess. It was said that every time Her Majesty summoned her, Her Majesty's mood would become very bad. But this time, there were no nobles causing trouble, and the Holy Cathedral of Fire was well behaved. Although the seventh prince's carriage accidentally fell off a cliff on the way back to the imperial city at the Latch of Tiles and was seriously injured, the mountain people were very obedient. They even sent a delegation to explain the matter. This delegation was about to arrive at the imperial city. This attitude showed that they had completely surrendered to Her Majesty. It seemed that there was no need for Her Majesty to be furious about this matter. On the other hand, there seemed to be no news from Flowerleaf and Ludwig. The rumors about the Tonagel Countess also seemed to have disappeared in the past few days. According to Her Majesty's maidservants, Her Majesty also did not summon a female countess recently. The only news that could be considered as news was that a few days ago, Bankel, Violet Valley and other regions reported a rare divine artifact reaction. However, these divine artifact resonances only occurred independently in a very small number of regions, and no one in the wider region observed it. The warlocks of the Tower of Stars and Moon had yet to conclude whether this was an illusion or reality. But in fact, in the entire circle of high-ranking nobles of the empire, only a few well-informed people knew that since that day, the empire had lost all news of the regions south of Anclova. The news here referred to the secret report of the night of the imperial court belonging to the royal family. Originally, there was a report every day, but since 3 days ago from Vargos to the Bear Lake region to Ruzef, and even the entire region south of the Rakoki stronghold complex, it was as if they had disappeared from the map. If it was a normal day, a delay of 1 or 2 days would not be a big deal. But before this, almost the entire empire's attention was focused on this region. The nobles of the empire were still waiting for the results of the final battle between Brando and the nobles of Anzaruda, but suddenly, there was no news of this region. Whether it was private or secret agents sent by the royal family, it was as if they had disappeared from the face of the earth. Everyone immediately thought that this was the doing of the Tonagel Countess. But the news that came later made the entire empire fall into a dead silence. In the early morning of the third day, Constance summoned her 2 knight commanders into the White Rose Garden. At this moment, the commander of the Royal Knight Regiment, Mr. Travis, and the commander of the Imperial Dragoons, Mr. Kevin, were wiping the cold sweat off their foreheads with a handkerchief. One of them came from the House of Pallet, while the other came from a noble family that the Queen trusted. On the surface, they were the leaders of the 2 imperial guards under Constance, but anyone who had lived in Rushta for a period of time would know that these 2 gentlemen were secretly in charge of the external affairs of the Imperial Court Knight Regiment. Chapter 924. Logically speaking, the 2 of them were the trusted aides of the Silver Queen. Even the slightest mishap wouldn't be enough to make them so nervous. However, 2 days ago, or to be more precise 2 nights ago, the Empire suddenly lost contact with Fort Persilian. Anyone with half a brain would know what that meant. Bad premonitions were often the most accurate. In the next 24 hours, bad news floated in like snowflakes. First, the Pegasus Knight of Asgard's garrison detected the movements of a large legion in the Bear Lake area. Then, another scout cavalry detected another legion in the Silver Spring Valley further south. 27 hours later, Vargos, Hemlock Town, and Forest Avenue were confirmed to have fallen. 29 hours later, Nephil and Taris of Gemini Town in the north of the Bear Lake area reported that traces of an unfamiliar army were found in the outskirts of Greystone Town in the lower reaches of the Silver Spring Valley. 34 hours later, the southern town of Gemini Town was lost. 2 hours later, the northern town was lost. 37 hours later, an imperial military outpost at the edge of the Long Boot Forest received some remnants from the south. Among them, Baron Pyrrhus of the Cooper family was found. 44 hours later, Greystone Town was surrounded. Half an hour later, the cavalry of Emerald Claw Fort finally brought back accurate news that Fort Persilian had fallen. A large army of Georgindy Ridge was attacking along the eastern branch of Broken Sword Mountains in the direction of Fort Elno. The Empire's Fort Legion was losing ground. 15 minutes ago, Ruzef was confirmed to have fallen. The Pegasus Knight flew over the city and observed that the city was bombarded by spells that exceeded the 12th circle. None of the residents in the city survived. Georgiandy Ridge had launched an invasion of the empire. Most of Anslova had fallen, the Evergreen Corridor was in danger, and Rokiki, the Broken Sword Mountains, had become a star in the distant sky. It was as if in an instant terrible news spread from the White Rose Garden to the entire imperial capital like a plague. The news followed the knight out of St. Cantilever Palace and into the mansions of the dukes, counts, imperial guards, knight orders, and important figures of the Holy Cathedral. It was as if a spark had been splashed into a pool of oil, setting the manors ablaze. Under the arched windows, in the attics, and in the private rooms of the nobles, candles were lit. Then people in plain clothes with their faces covered walked out from the back door, passed through the streets, and entered the houses of the nobles. Then came the servants. They hurriedly left their masters' mansions, drove carriages, or walked to thousands of unknown corners of the city. The news was whispered by word of mouth, passed from one person to the next, and the next person boarded a carriage and went along the streets to the 22 city gates of Rushta. Before dawn, countless carriages left the city and went in every direction of the empire. Some of them went to the countryside, some to the castles, and some to the docks. The news of the war rode the wind and broke the waves, spreading across the empire's territory. This was what happened in the 48 hours before Mr. Travis Burney and the captain of the dragoons, Mr. Kevin de Sanvaria, entered the White Rose. At this moment, in front of Constance, the captain of the dragoons appeared to be a little more rational, but Mr. Travis was almost trembling. The former was in charge of the evaluation of the internal knight's promotion, while he was mainly in charge of intelligence gathering and monitoring. Obviously, he was the one responsible for the current situation. The captain of the knight was trembling. He wanted to explain himself to the empire's most powerful person, but Constance didn't need an explanation. She wanted an answer. The two of them weren't the only ones in the Queen's study. All the important figures of the empire had already gathered together. Standing at the front was the captain of the White Legion, Marquis Nigel, Count Bendron, Donna's Little Netherwin, the head of the Cecil family, the current captain of the Azure Legion, Count Rodney, and Grand Duke Helix. Behind them were some nobles from other families, most of whom were close to Her Majesty. In addition, there were the envoys from the Holy Cathedral of Fire. These people were roughly divided into three camps. The nobles close to the Palutes were obviously gloomy, while the nobles from the Cecil family and the military were mostly smiling at this scene. The last group of people, led by Grand Duke Helix and Chancellor Little Netherwin, had a straight face and no expression could be seen on their faces. As for Her Majesty herself, her expression was normal. There wasn't a trace of anger in her eyes and of course, there wasn't a trace of leniency. But anyone who knew the Empire's most powerful person would understand that she was often the most terrifying when she was in this state. After a while, Constance finally spoke. She glanced at the two of them. Although Her Majesty still had the appearance of a young girl, her calm eyes showed that she was a shrewd woman. She spoke coldly, "This is the second time. My dear House of Palate and the nobles of the South, your recent performance is not worthy of your status. Mr. Commander, whether it is you or your brother, you have disappointed me. Why are you not saying a word? Are you waiting for me to speak?" Hearing this, the nobles of the Cecil family rejoiced in the misfortune of the Cecil family, while the soldiers looked as if they were waiting for a good show. Only Nidwin frowned. In his memory, the Queen rarely expressed her attitude so clearly, but this was already the third time in recent times. Whether it was the reprimand of the Cecil family in St. Cantifer Palace, the reprimand of Duke Palate in the White Rose Garden, or her current attitude, it all made him feel strange. However, to Nidwin this was merely an oddity. On the other hand, Donna's expression had long changed. How terrifying was the thunderous fury from the throne. He could not help but tremble in fear. He clenched his teeth, not daring to speak at all. On the other hand, Travis nearly swayed. Although His Majesty had said the word dear, Travis' face nearly turned green. After hesitating for a while, he could only reply respectfully, "I dare not, Your Majesty." "Then tell me, west of Emerald Claw Fort, what about the movements of the Lion Men in Toquinen?" "Nothing, Your Majesty." Travis quickly wiped his sweat and answered. "What about the elves in the wild of the Four Realms?" This time it was Nigel, the commander of the White Legion, who answered. The latter shook his head and said, "Nothing, but the elves should not have received the news yet. Otherwise, they would not have given up on this opportunity." "So at least Georgiandy Ridge has nothing to do with the Wind Elves?" Constance asked. When she asked this question, she frowned slightly as if she was thinking about something. But there was a faint feeling that the Queen's mind was not on everything that was happening at the moment. Like Prime Minister Nidwin, Nigel seemed to have noticed this as well. But this doubt only flashed in his mind for a moment before he shook his head and said, "Probably not. What about the Lionmen in Toquinen? The Lionmen should be waiting for news. As soon as the army of Georgindy Ridge arrives at Elner Castle, they will make their move." Little Nidwin looked at the Queen and finally spoke. "How big is the army of Georgindy Ridge?" Constance and the young Prime Minister looked at each other, then looked away and put pressure on Travis. The latter was sweating profusely and said, "Your Majesty, this is not clear, but they should have at least 2 legions in Anslova." The Silver Queen was silent, as if she was calculating something. Little Nidwin pondered for a moment and said, "It is very likely that the underground kings have already made their move. Otherwise, at least half of the lords of Georgindy Ridge would have to be mobilized to achieve this scale." "Their target is Asgard," Constance snapped out of her daze and said, "Then do we have any countermeasures now? Are there still troops in Anslova? We could have mobilized Anzaruta's army, but now." Little Nidwin stopped mid-sentence and looked at Donna's in the crowd. The latter's face darkened and he cursed the Prime Minister in his heart. He understood what the Prime Minister meant. Apart from the natives of Anzaruta, the local legions stationed there were mainly in the hands of Count Jean and Count Alcons. However, this part of the army had already been mobilized to replenish Fort Persilian. As for the rest of the noble army, everyone knew where it was. He quickly stepped forward and said, "Your Majesty, Anzaruta's army has already been replenished to Rokizi, the Broken Sword Mountain Range. The remaining militia and local defense forces are useless. Even if there were any, they would have been defeated by the unruly Count Tonagel." "Being fooled by an Erewhon is a glorious thing in Mr. Donna's eyes," Duke Cecil said sarcastically. The latter's face turned pale and red, but he did not dare to retort. The Prime Minister of the Empire was clearly unhappy with him. Constance's face returned to its cold expression. "Where is the nearest army?" 2 divisions of the White Legion's Pegasus Cavalry are stationed in Violet Valley, Your Majesty," Marquis Nigel replied immediately. "Can we make it in time?" Donna shook his head. "If we want to reinforce Azaf, we have to go through the Evergreen Corridor. Unless Greystone Town can hold on for at least 48 hours, we won't be able to make it in time." Constance looked at her courtiers with a mocking gaze. "In other words, we have to give up Anzaruta? Or if Rokizi, the Broken Sword Mountain Range, is lost, this is the greatest humiliation in the history of the Empire. You want me to bear it?" There was silence in the room. The Silver Queen looked at her courtiers and laughed coldly. "Donnas, go inform Duke Paluda that my bottom line is to protect Rokiki and the Broken Sword Mountain Range strongholds from being lost. If you can't even do that, it means that you don't have the right to manage this land. When that happens, let the White Legion take over the defense from Anzaruta to the Evergreen Corridor." Constance's voice was not loud, but it was like a thunderclap in the crowd. Everyone's eyes fell on the Queen's favorite courtier in an instant. Their gazes were filled with surprise, doubt, curiosity, sympathy, fear, and schadenfreude. Almost everyone present was an old fox who had been in the center of the Empire's power for a long time. They naturally understood the weight of this sentence. Her Majesty was really angry this time. Donna's body swayed and he almost fainted. He looked at the Prime Minister of the Empire with a pale face, but he did not dare to complain. He quickly bowed and said, "I understand." Only then did he dejectedly part the crowd and walk out of the study. Only the trembling Travice was left in the study, but Constance did not even bother to look at him. With a flick of her sleeve, she left the room with her maid. When Lodney and the other nobles left the White Rose Garden, he purposely stayed a step behind to catch up with Duke Helix. The latter was about to board his carriage when he noticed the actions of the new head of House Ashrick. He turned around and asked, "Count, is there anything I can help you with?" Lodney smiled bitterly. "My apologies, Duke Helix. I'm here to ask what you think of Her Majesty's words." Hearing this, the Duke stopped in his tracks and retracted his foot. He looked at Lodney with a serious expression. "What do you think, Count Helix? Her Majesty seems to have relaxed her surveillance on the military recently, but she's been suppressing us more and more in secret. I thought she would take the opportunity to support House Parrot, but I didn't expect." Duke Helix shook his head. "Her Majesty's personality has become more and more withdrawn. House Parrot has been out of her favor for some time now." Lodney seemed to have thought of something. Ever since that incident, Duke Helix shot him a wary glance. "Shut up. This isn't something we should be discussing. Little Rodney, since your father and I are old friends, I'll give you a word of advice. While there's still a chance, go back to your dominion. Lodney was stunned. Duke Helix, you? The Duke nodded. In less than a week, I will leave the royal capital and return to Flowerleaf Domain. Lodney looked at him in shock. Leaving the royal capital at this time was the same as leaving the center of the empire's power. It was something unimaginable for nobles of their level. Duke Helix shook his head. Little Lodney, you were still young back then, but I saw it with my own eyes. I don't want to experience it again. Alright, that's all I have to say. I'm only telling you this because of the relationship between our families. If you believe me, then believe me. If you don't, then don't spread it to anyone else. As for how to weigh the pros and cons, I'll leave it to you to figure it out yourself. After saying that, he waved at the ladder and boarded the carriage, leaving Rodney standing in the same place as he thoughtfully watched the carriage slide into the darkness. But in the end, Duke Helix smiled and shook his head. Bettina quietly slipped into the room and closed the door behind her. She then turned around and looked left and right in the dark room as if she was looking for something. At that moment, a voice called out. Bettina, you're back? The round-faced maid was startled. She then recognized the voice as the Count's and sighed in relief. Although she couldn't find where Scarlet was in the room, she quickly nodded. After a while, there seemed to be a moment of silence before the voice asked again, How is it? Are the rumors outside true? It's all true, Count Helix. It's said that the Empire lost the war in the south. Now Ansloy and Rakovich are in danger. She pondered for a moment as if she was trying to recall something. But it's strange. This time it's not the Lionmen or the Wind Elves of St. Tasso. It's the army of Jorgendy Ridge. I've never even heard of that place. Jorgendy Ridge? Scarlet was slightly startled. She suddenly remembered the cave dwellers led by Abes. She was in a daze for a moment. Her longing for Erwin grew stronger. With a creak, she opened the window. Only then did Betisha discover that her lord was actually standing by the window. The other party was hugging the emerald spear and staring out of the window in a daze. His eyes reflected the starlight under the distant night sky. She could not help but frown. Not good, the Count's illness is acting up again. After a while, Scarlet turned around. She seemed to have remembered something and called out. Bettina, Bettina. I'm here, Count Helix. Bettina hurriedly replied. How far is Ansloy from the Ruzif you mentioned last time? She asked softly. Bettina opened her mouth, but her heart skipped a beat. She couldn't say anything else. Scarlet's bright eyes stared at him. Is Count Helix there? Of course, Bettina knew who this his lordship was, but she couldn't help but grumble inwardly. She thought to herself, why did I help this Count to gather information? So this is his true purpose. But as a maid she didn't dare to lie, so she could only nod her head honestly. Before she could nod her head a second time, she felt her Count rush to her and grab her shoulder. He asked hurriedly, where is he? Where is the army of Jorgendy Ridge now? Is he in danger? Bettina was so scared that she almost screamed. She hurriedly shook her head with a pale face. How could a maid like her know about these things? Rumors about these things had spread like wildfire outside, but none of them were reliable. At most, she could only get a rough understanding of it. However, she knew that if she said that, Count Helix would probably not be able to sleep well for the next few days. She could only comfort him. Count Helix, that Tanajal lord might have left Ansloy long ago. If he takes a ship from Lone, it won't take long for him to reach Bankel. He might already be on the Sublime Sea by now. Scarlet seemed to have heard her words. She relaxed and looked at her maid. She nodded and said, Thank you, Betisha. Count Helix, this is what I should do. As Bettina spoke, she prayed in her heart. She hoped that Martha would bless Count Helix so that he could recover quickly and stop being so mysterious. P.S. Thank you to a certain PPT netizen for creating a relationship chart for Amber. I've received it and it's been of great help to me. Looking at these things, I can really feel everyone's deep love for Amber. I'm really touched. When I received this relationship chart, I felt full of motivation. I can continue writing Amber until the perfect ending. Thank you, everyone. Chapter 925. Brando pushed aside the trees, and the branches and leaves of the shrubs rustled as if a window had been opened in the dense, overlapping branches, revealing the scenery behind. Looking down, there were layers upon layers of terraces, and between the mountains there was a bright mirror. This was the Brown Bear Lake. Everyone let out a long sigh of satisfaction in unison. In order to avoid encountering Jorgendy Ridge, they had to trudge through the mountains and forests. It was not an easy task, especially after they abandoned their carriages. For these pampered young ladies and nobles, it was simply fatal. Brando, I think there's something over there. The Roman was the only one who did not seem to be tired. She held the hand of the Duke of Grenoire's daughter. The latter's wet nurse had to be supported by others to move forward. She peeked her head out and looked around. Soon she shouted. Brando knew that her senses were extraordinary, so he quickly stopped and asked, "Can you see what it is?" "Looks like people." "Want to? Are they alive or dead?" Giara asked. These days they had seen the merchant girl's ability more than once. At first, some were doubtful, but gradually they became envious and amazed. Because of the Roman, the envoy's guards did not even have to risk releasing gargoyles into the sky to investigate. Although the gargoyles had a wide field of vision, they were more likely to be exposed in the sky. Georgandy Ridge also had harpies and drakes as their air force. I don't know. The two of them were sitting back to back under a beech tree. Did they move? I don't think so. Then they're probably dead. Where are they? By the lake. There's a white rock over there, right under the third tree, the Roman replied. Everyone gasped. It was at least 10 miles from here to the Brown Bear Lake, and they could only see layers upon layers of tree canopies as far as the eye could see. However, the merchant girl could see the two people under the tree by the lake. What kind of eyesight was that? The Duke of Grenoire's daughter looked at the Roman holding her hand with admiration and said crisply, "Sister Roman, you're amazing." The Roman was overjoyed, but she pretended to be serious and replied, "Of course I'm amazing." Brando looked at her. Although her face was tense, her curved eyes revealed her thoughts. He shook his head and said, "Let's go and take a look." It was impossible to continue avoiding Georgandy Ridge when they arrived at the Bear Lake area. There was a town called Greystone, which was the only exit to the west of the silver gushing valley. Brando and he believed that the people of the Underdark. So instead of passively fighting, it was better to prepare first. The group walked down the mountain and walked to the place Roman said. Sure enough, they saw two people sitting back to back under a tree. They were two Kurlutzian soldiers who had been dead for a long time. The group parted the bushes and approached the corpses. The Roman hurriedly covered the eyes of the Duke's daughter with her hand. The others could see the gray robes on the two corpses and the star-shaped rose emblem on the robes. Brando recognized the emblem as Savin's emblem, which was the emblem of the Land Dragon Knight of Caronia. This proved that the two corpses were soldiers of Anslova's army. The Land Dragon Knight of Caronia. This is Sir Fister's army. Some Cruz nobles recognized the corpses and whispered, "Has the North Mountain Outpost been lost?" "Where's the North Mountain Outpost?" Brando asked. "It's north of here on the only way to Buos." Rogers looked at the two corpses and replied. Brando nodded and squatted down beside the corpses. He carefully examined the wounds. The first corpse had a penetrating wound, but it was not fatal. He had died from excessive blood loss. He compared the wound to the armor under the robes and came to a conclusion. The Land Dragon Knight of Caronia was a Grade 3 unit. The one who killed him should be another Grade 3 unit from Georgandy Ridge, the Razor Boar. The Razor Boar was a tamed beast of the subterrane dwellers. Since the Razor Boar was here, there should be subterrane dwellers around. The Razor Boar's special ability was Charge and Death Strike. The ability of Charge was similar to a warrior's charge. Death Strike allowed it to generate a false life force equivalent to 10% of its total health after receiving enough damage to kill it. It would only die after the false life force was depleted or it lasted for more than 10 minutes. Brando thought of the Razor Boar's ability and suddenly cursed. Why was it so similar to his own ability? However, he was even more puzzled about the Razor Boar's ability being countered by the Land Dragon Knight's low roar. The low roar of the Land Dragon Knight could induce fear in most beasts except for monsters. This was the weapon used by the Land Dragon Knights against other cavalry. It was also effective against the Razor Boar. Logically speaking, if the Land Dragon Knight wanted to run away, the Razor Boar would not pose a real threat to them. With such doubts in mind, he checked the second corpse. The injuries on this corpse were very strange. The neck and arms were strangely bent, as if they were broken. Generally speaking, such injuries were caused by blunt force. However, there was no blunt force injury on this corpse. Brando was puzzled. Princess Magadal, accompanied by Dilfari, frowned and looked at the two corpses. She then said, "Count Brando, there is no need to be puzzled. He fell to his death." Fell to his death? Brando suddenly realized. This person must have fallen from the Caronia Land Dragon's back and broken his spine. He must have died on the spot. His body must have been rescued by his companion, but the latter also died from excessive blood loss. It can't be that simple. How can a well-trained Land Dragon Knight fall from the back of a dragon? They are fixed to the saddle, Chiara replied. She squatted down beside Brando and was about to poke the two corpses with her hands. However, before she could touch them, her hands were pulled away by Brando. "Child, stay away from these things," Brando replied impatiently. "I'm not a child." Brando stopped and looked at the little one. Chiara appeared to be very unhappy. She muttered something to herself, but no one could hear it clearly. Presumably it wasn't anything good. However, Chiara's words reminded him that the Land Dragon Knight was thrown off the back of the Land Dragon. The belts on his waist and legs were all broken. Judging from the ends, it was obvious that they were torn and not cut. The Shadrian caveman obviously did not have the ability to do that. Only a land dragon could do that. However, Caronia land dragons were very docile. They rarely went berserk on the battlefield and they were not easily frightened. They also had a deep affection for their masters. Even if their riders were killed, they would stay beside their dead riders for a long time. Brando really could not figure out why the two Caronia land dragon knights died here alone. There was no sign of their mounts nearby. It was still acceptable if a Caronia land dragon went berserk by accident, but this scene was just too bizarre. He thought for a long time, but he still could not figure it out. At this moment, the Roman suddenly shouted from behind, "Ah! What a big rat!" The Roman shouted again. Everyone turned their heads towards the source of the sound and saw a giant rat escaping from the forest. Its entire body was gray, and it had a long earthworm-like tail. There were 3 strange bone spurs on its back, and its head was larger than a normal house rat's. Its mouth was wide open, and other than the large incisors of rodents, there were 2 rows of sharp teeth. It was hiding under a rock nearby, and it did not expect to be discovered. It jumped in fright and wanted to escape into the bushes. But when Brendel saw it, he picked up the sword beside the corpse and threw it over. A silver light flashed, and the giant rat was nailed to the ground with a thud. The young daughter of the Duke of Grenoires happened to see this. She let out a low cry and hurriedly hid behind Roman. "What is this?" Chiara frowned and looked at the little creature that was struggling on the ground with disgust. "It's a demon rat from the catacombs, the hunting dog of the Shadar cavemen," Maynard answered from behind. "They used this thing to spy on us?" Avram was so scared that his fat jiggled. The ball-shaped son of the Duke looked around in horror as if the forest was full of rats staring at them. "Don't tell me we've already been discovered? But this thing is very conspicuous. As long as it gets close to us, I will notice it," the Roman replied. "Actually, it's not a big deal. Don't worry." Everyone looked at the merchant lady as if they were looking at a freak. However, her words more or less calmed everyone down. Some of them were not willing to follow Brando at first, but the experience in the past 2 days had proven his ability. He knew the underworld creatures better than anyone else. With his experience and judgment, they were able to walk out of Vargas and avoid all the battles that could be avoided. The crew's people followed Brando at first because they were captives, but now they saw him as their savior. Over the past few days they had passed by Hemlock Town, Valgus and several other villages. They had witnessed the scene after the Georgiandy Ridge's army passed by. The villagers who had been turned into statues, the Empire soldiers, and the subterranean dwellers' heads that were impaled on their spears reminded them of the current situation. Now, no one dared to doubt that they were facing an army from the underworld. Even the most stubborn Count Jean had shut his mouth. The nobles began to panic, and Brendel, who was the only one who remained calm, became their only support. After all, compared to those ferocious monsters, humans were much more amiable. The only thing that made them complain was that Brendel had converted their servants and guards into reserve troops, and confiscated their rations and changed them into uniform rations. The sudden appearance of the demonic rats in the catacombs had diverted everyone's attention. Brando did not dwell on the matter of the land dragons. He told Maynard about his suspicions, and the female knight was equally puzzled. However, she did not have an answer either. After that, the 2 of them stopped wasting time on it. Obviously, there was no time to bury the corpses, but Brando still asked Rogers and the other 3 to tidy up the appearance of the 2 Caronia land dragon knights after they died. Then, they arranged for them to be placed in a secluded place to ensure at least a basic level of decency. The 4 internal knights were very grateful to him. Even the nobles from Cruz had a vague feeling that the Count from Tonagel was not a rude person. The accumulated hatred between them had also been resolved. The team left the lakeside and continued north. Brando's goal was to bypass the Brown Bear Lake before dark and reach the vicinity of Greystone Town. However, when he realized that there might be Shadrins in the vicinity, he asked the team to slow down. The team moved slowly along the forest surrounded by mountains. After that, they discovered a few more corpses of the Empire's local legions. One of them was a small group of walking swordsmen, and the other was another Caronia land dragon knight. However, they did not find his mount either. After that, they began to see signs of a fierce battle and the corpses of the land dwellers. They were a type of cavemen with purple-red skin and long manes. Their bodies were scattered all over the forest filled with fallen leaves. It was obvious that an army of Georgiandy Ridge that was moving north along the Brown Bear Lake had encountered the local legions of Crews. Both sides engaged in a fierce battle in the forest. There were even traces of magic bombardment in the forest. A streak of flame plowed through the nearby beech trees, leaving a scorched land that was dozens of feet wide and hundreds of feet long. The ashes were filled with pieces of melted metal and other things. Brando estimated that at least half a squadron of Empire soldiers had died here. However, he was a little puzzled. This kind of magic was a bit like the chain of fire thrown by the evil sorcerers. Elementalists and law-defying wizards did not have similar spells. The wild elf sister, Falerne, stood beside the scorched land for a long time, frowning and not saying a word. "It's not elemental magic," she finally answered. They crossed the broken battlefield, but more and more of such scenes appeared. It was hard to imagine what had happened in the forest. Some of the places looked like the land left behind by demons. However, Countess Yenbao was very sensitive to demons. Brando asked her a few times, but all he got was a negative answer. Rogers, Trevor, and Nasha were silent. The nobles behind them were also silent. In their minds, the Empire was difficult to defeat, but the scene in front of them had clearly shattered their fragile expectations. At this time, Brando's position in their hearts had become even more important. But among all of them, only the black-haired young man named Kue was talking to himself. Why did they attack Buos? Are they planning to go around Greystone Town? Brando heard this sentence and looked back at Maynard. Then both of them shook their heads gently. They arrived at the vicinity of Greystone Town a little later than expected. The sun was slowly setting below the mountains, but there were still a few rays of light in the valley. Brendel and the others stood on a nearby mountain and observed the town downstream of the Silver River. The direction of Greystone Town was dark, like a shadow in the valley. The sunset in the sky had a blood-red glow, as if it was a sign of some kind of disaster before it arrived. No one in the group spoke. Everyone obviously understood what had happened. However, there was even worse news. Brando saw a few harpies hovering in the sky, which meant that there were still underground garrisons in the town. The nobles' faces were a little ugly because this meant that their wishful thinking of easily passing through the exit of the Silver River Valley had failed. Brando had already expected this. He cautiously led the others from the mountain and slowly retreated to the forest behind. He was ready to discuss what to do, whether to wait for the garrisons of Georgiandy Ridge to leave or to pass through at night. But at this time, the Roman stretched out her small hand and patted Brando's back. She whispered, Brando, look over there. There are a few people." Brando was shocked. He thought to himself, "Miss Roman, if you have something to say, can't you say it earlier?" But his body's reaction was faster than his brain. He almost subconsciously pulled the merchant girl to hide in the bushes. Although the others did not understand what was going on, they followed suit and found a place to hide. The Roman got up from the bushes and spat out a few mouthfuls of grass. She raised her head and wanted to continue looking around, but Brando pressed her small head down. "Where is it?" Brando looked out through the bushes and asked. "There is a row of short trees below. There are a few people hiding under there. Do you see it, Brando? They seem to want to go to the other side." Someone ran out. "It's that sneaky guy." The Roman kept trying to move Brando's hand away from her head, but it was in vain. In the end, she could only answer with some frustration. Brando looked in the direction she pointed and saw a figure flash and disappear under the dense canopy of a goose-eared stalagmite. "That's Walton," Nasha suddenly whispered when she saw the figure. "Who is Walton?" Brando immediately looked at the Knight of Crews and asked. "He is the captain of Sir Cooper's guard. I have seen him once. He is a swordsman from Ludwig." Nasha looked at him with some distrust and hesitated for a moment before replying. Brando looked back at Rogers, who quickly explained, "Nasha has a special ability. As long as she has seen someone, she will never forget them. If she thinks it is them, then it must be them." "Why are they here?" Trevor was a little puzzled. "I thought they had been killed on the north side of the Forest Leaf Avenue like the Moore family." Chapter 926. Brando understood that the knight named Trevor was talking about what happened a day ago. After they left Vargas, they headed north along the surging Milky Way. They encountered a battlefield left behind after a fierce battle on the north side of the avenue. The two sides of the battle were obviously the private army of the imperial nobles and the underground creatures of Georgiandy Ridge. The battlefield spanning the long river and woodland avenue was covered with corpses of humans, drakes, griffins, cavemen, and harpies. The blood had long solidified in the bone-chilling cold of winter, forming a dark red color on the pebbles. The nobles of Cruz recognized many familiar faces from the pile of corpses. Sir Moore was one of them. A bone arrow pierced through his throat, causing him to fall on his back on the battlefield, becoming one of the many cold corpses. Such a scene usually represented a fiasco of the empire. The nobles of Cruz would not easily leave the bodies of their companions behind for the sake of dignity. Even the corpses of the nobles were ignored. It was almost possible to imagine the scene of Earl Alcorn and his men stepping on the cold river to escape to the north. As for Georgandy Ridge, the underground creatures rarely cleaned up the corpses on the battlefield unless they were short of rations. The impact of the plague on them was even less. Brando, they seemed to be planning to sneak into the town. The Roman suddenly reminded in a low voice. The merchant lady's eyes shone in the twilight, like a cat's eyes in a low-light environment. Brando also noticed this at this time. He immediately said to Rogers, "Mr. Knight, do you have any way to contact them?" Rogers thought for a moment and said, "I know that the local army of Anzaruta has a secret signal. Maybe we can try it." "You can try, but don't let those things above us find us." "I understand." Rogers nodded and crawled into the bushes. He lay there and looked at the dark trees below. Then he put his thumb and index finger into his mouth and whistled. The whistle echoed in the forest under the twilight. It sounded like the scream of an owl, but obviously sharper. The cry of the owl attracted the attention of the harpies above. These monsters drew a huge 8 in the air and flew in this direction. The people in the bushes were motionless, quietly waiting for the patrolling eyes in the sky to leave. After a while, the feathered beasts did not find anything unusual and flew back again. Brendel heard the people around him heaving sighs of relief, and he himself was slightly relieved as well. Only the merchant girl beside him did not seem to be afraid at all, as though she did not have a care in the world. The surroundings were silent, gradually leaving only the sound of insects in the darkness. The silhouettes in the goose-eared stalagmites also stopped moving. Roger's forehead was full of nervous cold sweat. He knew several secret codes of the Imperial Army in the Anzaruta region, but he was not sure if they would come in handy at this time. He knew very well what the private armies of these local nobles were like. What he was most worried about was not that these guys could not hear the secret signal, but that they misunderstood the secret signal and did something out of line. If it attracted the attention of the garrison in the city, then it would be a ghost. At this time he suddenly realized that maybe it was the right choice to not speak just now. The silence lasted for a while, and then the trees below moved again. There was a rustling sound. "Hey!" The Shire looked a little surprised. "There are magicians among them." It was as if a gust of wind had suddenly risen in the forest. The mountain breeze brushed past the canopy and rustled the branches. However, everyone could hear a human whisper amidst the rustling noise. "Who is that?" This was the wind message spell, one of the few communication spells that could be used in areas that were blocked by magic. Because it relied on the power of nature instead of breaking the law of space, this time spells like the elemental anchor could not work on it. The best elven envoys and druids could even send messages to areas thousands of miles away. However, the wind message spell was slow. It sometimes took a week or even a few months for the wind to travel from one area to another. Moreover, for most elemental envoys, the wind message spell was only a short-distance communication spell that did not exceed the visual range. The sorcerers in the army often used it as a supplement for sign language and lip reading. Brando turned to the Shire and said, "Tell them that we are Earl Jean's men." The Shire looked at his lord in surprise, wondering if Earl Jean, who was now a prisoner, would die of anger after hearing this. Of course he still did as he was told. Although he was not an elementalist, there were several commonalities among common magic spells. Moreover, one of the characteristics of magic spells was the law of imitation. For an existence of his level, it was not difficult to imitate a magic spell like the wind message. He easily transmitted the message over, and even the words in the wind were more fluent than the other parties. The Shire's method obviously surprised the other party. After a short moment of silence, Brando saw 6 or 7 people standing up one by one under the goose-eared mahogany bushes at the bottom of the hill. They poked their heads out and looked in his direction. He deliberately waved to them to let them know where they were. When the latter saw him, they immediately rushed to the top of the hill. The vegetation on the hill was very dense. Apparently, their short run did not attract any attention from the sky. After a while, they came to a circle of bushes at the top of the hill. The person running at the front was the first to see Erwin's delegation behind him. "You," The man obviously recognized Brando. His face changed and he subconsciously wanted to retreat. However, Brando did not give him the chance to do so. He directly raised his hand, and the lines of law in the vast space lit up at the same time, like a net covering the 7 people. Then he pulled his hand and the 7 people appeared around them at the same time, and then fell heavily to the ground. The 7 people fell to the ground one by one. When Rogers saw one of them, he whispered in surprise, "Sir Cooper, you're still alive." The man called Sir Cooper looked to be in his early 40s or 50s, but he was short and had a shifty look. His appearance obviously did not match his aristocratic status. However, those who knew him well knew that he was a shrewd guy. When he heard his captain's whisper, he knew something was wrong. He subconsciously turned around and wanted to escape, but unfortunately he was a step too late. Before he could take a step, he felt his body being pulled up by an invisible force. He was lifted into the air and then fell heavily to the ground. Just as he was scared out of his wits, he faintly heard someone calling his name. Naturally, the monsters of the Georgindy Ridge would not recognize him. The person who spoke Cruz was also a standard local accent of Anzaruta. His mind was working fast, and when he heard the whisper he immediately calmed down. "Don't shout." He hurriedly whispered to his men, and then raised his head and looked around suspiciously. His eyes first fell on Brando and then his face changed. Apparently, he recognized the Count who had turned Anzaruta upside down. But then he noticed Rogers and his eyes were slightly surprised. "I know you. Your father is Burgart. Weren't you selected to join the Royal Knight Regiment? Why are you here?" It's a long story. Rogers did not dare to reveal his true identity. He smiled bitterly and said, "I came to Anzaruta for a special mission. I didn't expect to encounter such a thing. Now, I'm almost the same as you, a prisoner of the Count. But the Count has promised to take us to a safe place. In comparison, the Count only wants a ransom. Sir Cooper, don't tell me you want to be a prisoner of those monsters?" Cooper shuddered. Those monsters were murderous. He had seen with his own eyes how the caveman beheaded an aristocrat and stuck his bloody head on a spike. He hurriedly shook his head and ordered his subordinates to take off their swords and hand them over to Brendel. He then bowed to Brendel in a manner that was much calmer than the hesitant Count Jean. "Count Jean, my safety is in your hands. I have absolute trust in your words." Brando smiled. He did not know that he had any credibility in these people's hearts. The only friendship he had with these Anzaruta nobles was that he had captured a large number of hostages from them. Just half a week ago they still called him a demon. But now he had become the Count with outstanding credibility. Not to mention Brando, even Avram, who was hiding in the woods behind, could not help but be speechless when he saw this scene. The chubby young man could not help but turn his face and ask the Duke's daughter who was squatting in the bushes with him, "Tell me, am I dreaming, Eugenie?" The Duke's daughter's expression was very complicated, and she responded softly. Brando knew that Rogers was beating around the bush to remind Cooper of his attitude towards him, but he did not care. This knight of the inner court was very good at talking. "Sir Cooper," Rogers noticed Brando's attitude and continued, "Why are you here? Where are the others?" When Cooper heard this question, his wrinkled face crumpled into a ball. "Don't mention it, Count Alcon has been caught by those monsters." "What? The Count is not dead yet?" Rogers was taken aback and also attracted Brando's attention. "As far as I know, he shouldn't be dead yet, but I can't rule out the possibility that something happened during this period that I don't know about yet." Cooper was obviously shocked by Rogers' reaction and had to carefully consider his answer. No, I thought you were all wiped out at Linia Avenue." Rogers realized that he had misunderstood and hurriedly corrected himself to explain. "Not really, but it's almost there." Cooper sighed, "It's all those damn monsters' fault. That night we were all in a hurry to rush north. These rats were waiting in the dark to ambush us. Sir Moore, who was at the front, was the first to be attacked. Sigh, poor old Moore. He was as strong as an ox. We all thought that he would live until the end of time. Things are really unpredictable. At that time in the dark, none of us knew who the enemy was. They came from all directions, everywhere in the sky and on the ground. We were quickly defeated. I was at the southernmost side and only saw the Count and the others fleeing north across the river." "And then, how did you know that Count Alcon was caught?" Brando suddenly asked. "I saw it with my own eyes. After I was separated from the Count that night, I have been trying to find out where the others went. Later I learned that they went to Buos." "Buos?" Rogers, Trevor, and Natasha couldn't help but blurt out the name at the same time when they heard the answer. "What's wrong?" Cooper looked at them in confusion. "Nothing, continue," Brando replied. Cooper nodded with some suspicion and continued, "Actually, it wasn't Buo's. Before the Count and the others reached Buo's, they were surrounded at the North Mountain sentry post. When I arrived there, I saw them being captured by the cavemen with my own eyes." North Mountain sentry post? But why would Count Alcon go in that direction? Rogers asked, puzzled. Buo's is a dead end. Brando had asked Princess Magadol about Buo's in advance. He knew that there was a crystal mine there before the Year of Thunder. However, that place prospered because of the mine, but it also declined because of the mine. Ever since the mine was cut off, the town that was famous for the mine also declined day by day and gradually became a forgotten corner. However, he thought that the Count probably wanted to find a place to hide. He knew that he couldn't be faster than the cavemen, nor did he have any delusions about breaking through the encirclement and escaping to Asgard or Lone. He could only hope that the first target of the underground creatures of Jorgindi Ridge was Asgard, and that they wouldn't find trouble with him. But unfortunately, things didn't go as planned. I think the Count has underestimated the size of the army of monsters. According to my observation, there are at least 4 different dungeon lords on the battlefield at Anslova. They are confident that they can take down Asgard in the first place, and they can also spare some troops to deal with the defenders of Buo's. Cooper shook his head. No one would have thought of that. We didn't even expect them to come. Rogers shook his head with a wry smile. Those underground rats know us too well. We don't even know who's leading them, but they know us very well. On the surface he was just complaining, but he carefully concealed the chilling speculation in his heart. He didn't forget that the cavemen had besieged them. Although the existence of the internal court knight was a semi-open secret in the Empire, few people knew about their identities outside. The internal court knight's contact method was only in the hands of a few people. He really couldn't imagine how the cavemen found them. Was it a coincidence or a man-made factor? Several names came to his mind. If any of these names betrayed the Empire, it would be an unimaginable disaster. He could only pray and hope that it was just a prank by Lady Martha. Brando listened to the conversation between the two, but his eyes fell on the shadowy valley in the distance. He suddenly felt something and asked, "Is Count Alcon in Greystone Town now?" Cooper stopped talking and looked back at Brendel. After a while he said, "I saw them enter Greystone Town around 4 or 5 o'clock in the afternoon. The sun hadn't set yet and the long line passed through the valley. They came from the direction of the North Mountain sentry post, and I could clearly see that there were many human prisoners in the line. If the Count is not dead, I think he should be inside." Was Greystone Town captured before that? It was captured before that. Then how can you confirm whether Count Alcon and the others are still in the town, or have already left the town from the other side of the valley and been transferred to other places? Cooper opened his mouth. "To be honest, I haven't thought about it." He looked at Brando in confusion. He didn't expect the young Count Erwin to think so carefully. Brando didn't care about Cooper's question. He then asked, "Have the patrolling harpies in the sky changed shifts?" "What?" The latter replied truthfully. "Then were there any harpies in the Jorgindi Ridge army that attacked Count Alcon?" "This doesn't seem to be the case." "That's right." Brando pulled the collar of the Count's trench coat to prevent the cold night wind from blowing into his collar. He stared at the valley and replied, "The Shadow Cavemen have 2 famous lords. One is Gerard the Wizard and the other is Tampo. Neither of these 2 clans has allied with the Harpies. That is to say, the Jorgindi Ridge garrison in the town has not exchanged defense with the Shadow Cavemen. They've already left." Cooper asked cautiously. "That's not necessarily true. What I mean is that there might be more than one lord's army stationed in this town." Brendel's brows were tightly knitted together. This was not good news for them. Cooper also subconsciously shut his mouth. He didn't understand what the Count was thinking. "Sir Cooper, are you sure that the Jorgindi Ridge army returned from the North Mountain sentry this afternoon?" "What do you mean by that, Count? My scouts won't lie to me." Cooper was a little angry because he felt questioned. "Don't be angry. I'm not doubting you, Sir Cooper. I just want to confirm one thing. Did your scouts really see the Jorgindi Ridge army return to Greystone Town after attacking Count Alcon at the North Mountain sentry?" Cooper was about to answer yes, but he only said half a word before he was stunned. Then he looked surprised. Roger's reaction was even stronger than his. He almost jumped up and shouted, "They returned directly to Greystone Town after attacking the North Mountain sentry? What about Buo's? Were they just going for Count Alcon?" Cooper was at a loss. "I don't know what's going on either." Chapter 927. Brando smiled as he got the answer he wanted. He turned around and looked at Maynard, who was lying in the same direction. The latter's eyes were as sharp as a knife. She nodded at him gently. At this moment, the sun had begun to sink into the inland sea of the empire in the west. At the last moment before sunset, the sea in the far west burned and turned into a whole piece of pure gold. But as the last ray of light sank below the sea level, the golden water was quickly dissipating, leaving only a dark red color, like a casting that was gradually cooling. From the west to the east, Greystone Town was surrounded by rolling hills. On a cloudless day, the view in the sky was extremely wide, especially the Anzaruta Mountains in the distance and the endless plains in the east formed a magnificent picture. But after dusk fell, the distant mountains seemed to be shrouded in a layer of twilight, becoming hazy, like an impressionist oil painting. The boundary between the sky and the earth was shrouded in a layer of orange halo and clouds, becoming blurred. But all of this eventually returned to the silent night. As the light dimmed, the creatures who were used to the darkness could see more clearly. The harpies hovering above the town seemed to have noticed the unusual movement on the nearby hills. They circled the hills for a long time while squeaking. But before they could attract the attention of others, a sudden commotion broke out in Greystone Town. Loud noises came from a few streets. The noise and clamor attracted the attention of the feathered beasts again. They turned around and flew back into the town. Translator, Endless Fantasy Translation Editor. Endless Fantasy Translation in Greystone Town, the subterranean dwellers were capturing residents, imperial soldiers, adventurers, and other dangerous people who were hiding. They were not used to the daytime, so the search began in the evening and soon the town was in a mess. On the second floor of the Bullfrog's Cry Inn, the smelly searchers had just left. Suddenly, a cloak was lifted among a pile of debris. It was as if a door was opened in the wall, and a small figure appeared behind it. In the dark room, a pair of lake-like green eyes appeared. The eyes were big and clear. It blinked gently, and then a look of relief appeared on its face. It was a little girl wearing a dark green cloak, but the cloak was a little strange. It was obviously an adult's traveling cloak. Only the hem was cut to fit her small stature so that it did not drag to the ground. However, the huge hood could not be changed, so the little girl had to hold the edge of the hood from time to time to prevent it from drooping down and blocking her view. It looked very funny. Under the huge hood, the little girl's light silver hair was tied into two short ponytails behind her pointed ears. It seemed to be the only distinguishing feature of her identity. Generally speaking, such a half-elf with wild elf blood could only be seen in the north of the Greyhues Knights Legion, or even further north in Eloranta. In addition, she carried a crossbow that was almost half her height and wore a pair of short leather boots with feathers stuck to the left and right sides of the boots. The little girl stood on her tiptoes and just happened to put her chin on the window lattice. She looked up and stared at the harpies in the air until they flew away again. Then she struggled to climb up the desk, knelt on the desk, opened the window and quietly glanced at the street below. The cavemen were already far away. She closed the window and answered with a trembling voice, Jude, is it far away? That seems to be the case. They didn't notice us. A small voice asked curiously. A small, triangular head appeared under the wide hood. This little thing looked a little like a giant dragon thousands of times smaller. It even had the same horns, sharp teeth, and folded wing membranes. However, it was not a dragon but a pseudo-dragon. Wand had very little information about this strange species. They were only mentioned in a few legends and biographies. Scholars on the shores of the abyssal sea thought that they were the spirits of books and knowledge, and they were often accompanied by books. However, this was only to satisfy their curiosity about the world. For the same reason, they would accompany mortals and go on adventures in various parts of the world. The little elf is scared. This place is not fun at all. These people are bad. They are not friendly to the little elf at all. You reap what you sow. From the moment you broke their catapult, you shouldn't have expected them to be friendly to you. Jude replied snappily. The little elf looked a little scared. She hurriedly explained, I didn't see what it was. I just wanted to touch it. Then you didn't have to cut the rope. But I have a feeling that if I cut the rope, something terrible will happen. Jude replied in a shrill voice, It did happen, and then we became wanted criminals. Before that, we still have to hide from place to place, the little elf pouted. Before coming here, Shania didn't tell me about these strange things. Didn't you say that this is a human kingdom? Yes, it was before I left last time. When was that? About 300 years ago. Let's not talk about that for now. The little elf pulled Jude off her head and stuffed her into her pocket, ignoring the latter's protests. You really saw that thing? Yes, I saw it. It was that bastard who brought us down from the sky. I would recognize her even if she turned into ashes. Jude finally escaped from the little elf's clutches. She poked her head out of the pocket and replied, "If you didn't make such a big commotion, I would have caught up with her long ago." "I'm sorry," the little elf replied, feeling wronged. Jude replied proudly, "Fortunately, I was smart enough to put a magic mark on that thing. As long as she hasn't left the city, I will be able to find her." She gestured with her claws a few times on the little elf's body. "Let me see. She didn't go far. She's just nearby. There. Where is she? Lift me up," Jude ordered. The elf took her out of her pocket and carried her to the window with both hands. She looked out at the street and pointed to one of the roofs. "There," she said, "do you see that roof over there in the east? She's in the attic over there." The little elf leaned against the window and looked out for a while. "Oh, I know. She's hiding in that candy shop." "What candy shop?" "The one we went to the other day. The chubby owner. There were 4 strange arrows on the sign over the door. Don't you remember?" "Oh, I remember now," said Sydney. "But it wasn't a confectionery, it was a bakery, and those 4 queer arrowheads were compasses. Rove's compasses. You see, I remember the name of them. Oh no. We have to go through 2 streets to get there. I remember one of those stinky bastard sentries. What are we to do? They'll catch you as soon as you show your face. They'll prepare a big pot for you. They'll make soup out of the little elf with salt, onions and carrots." "Never mind. They won't find us if we go that way." "Which way?" The little elf climbed down from the desk. There was not a single bit of light in the dark inn, but her green eyes flashed in the darkness, not affected in the slightest. She opened the door and went down the hall, up the stairs to the ground floor and into the kitchen, which had a cellar covered with thick planks of cabbage and potatoes. "What is this place?" Jude asked. "There's a secret passage down here that leads to the candy shop opposite." "The baker's workshop," Shani corrected, but then she asked, "Why is there a secret passage in the inn leading to the baker's workshop?" The elf shook her head. "I heard the innkeeper talking to a woman about it." "A woman?" "A very beautiful woman. She gave me a piece of candy." "You mean you eavesdropped on them and she gave you a piece of candy?" Jude asked incredulously. "No. I was standing so far away that they thought I couldn't hear them. But the little elf heard them clearly." "Don't you feel any guilt?" The elf obviously didn't have that kind of superfluous thing. She pushed the cabbage and potatoes off the planks, which tumbled to the ground. Then she lifted the planks to reveal a dark staircase. There was indeed a secret passage under the cellar, and the entrance was hidden behind a row of wine racks. The passage was long, dark, and winding. She did not know how many turns it had taken, but it was still up and down. In some places water had accumulated and dripped, but the elf was not afraid at all. She looked around curiously as if she was on an adventure. In fact, it was indeed an adventure. However, no matter how long the passageway was, there was always an end. Soon, the man and the dragon groped their way to an iron door. The iron door was tightly shut, without a single gap. Jude was about to fly to the door handle to cast a spell, but the elf grabbed her tail. "Wait, there's someone behind us." "Don't grab my tail," Jude screamed. The elf put a finger to her lips. Shoo! A moment later there was a rumbling sound from behind the iron door. It sounded like someone was dragging something. The noise lasted for a while before it stopped. Then there was the sound of footsteps. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, the elf counted. The 6 of them entered the room one by one. Then there was the sound of the door closing. Jude was startled. "Are they coming in?" The elf shook her head. "They're not coming," she said as if she had seen it herself. There was a moment of silence behind the door. Then there was a man's voice. "Miss Delphian, we've come at a bad time. We don't know where those things came from. Please make a decision. We can't stay here any longer. We know of a secret passage in the city that leads to the lower reaches of the surging Milky Way. But if we're late, those monsters will find it." A soft female voice replied, "I know where these things came from. That person has a group of subterranean dwellers in his territory, which shows that his relationship with Georgandy Ridge is not ordinary. They have been plotting this for a long time, but no one thought that he would actually dare to make a move against the Empire." The elf heard the voice from the other end of the passage. "It's her," she said to Jude. "It's that woman?" The elf nodded. She thought for a moment and said, "I know. She must be the owner of the candy shop." "Do people call the owner of the candy shop, Miss, in your hometown?" Jude sneered. "She's in the candy shop. Of course she's the owner. Good logic." At this time, a young voice spoke from behind the door. Elman must have seen through that person's scheme in the loop of trade winds. That's why he was killed. Thank you, Mr. F. That person is treacherous and cunning. I've asked Endesha. If he didn't leave Elman and the others behind, she wouldn't have had the chance to act. That woman is detestable, but some hypocrites deserve to be judged. Elman swore to protect me for his entire life. Now that he's gone, I'm still his wife. I'll avenge him. The first voice sighed. Miss Delphian. Don't worry. No matter how long you stay here, we'll protect you. Thank you, Mr. Solons. You're welcome. The subterranean dwellers attacked the North Mountain Sentry Post today. That place has no value to them. If they were going after buoys, it might make sense, but they only attacked the North Mountain Sentry Post, the young voice spoke. The subterranean dwellers won't do meaningless things. But I heard that Count Alcon is in that place. That person has a grudge with the nobles in the south of the empire, so I'm guessing that he's most likely with the subterranean dwellers. Our people have also heard that there's a mysterious human beside Tanpu, the rough male voice replied. Then it's most likely him. Why would a normal person be with those monsters, especially at this time of the year? A new voice spoke. It was a slightly hoarse voice. Can you find out where Tanpu and his whereabouts are? The woman asked. That's not difficult. These monsters are probably used to the underground tunnels. They're not used to our buildings. We can easily get close to their base. Very well. Find a way to set up ambushes on his path. Don't get too close. That person is very powerful. The young voice spoke again. No matter how powerful he is, he won't be able to dodge the Demon Slayer's spear. There's no harm in being careful, the rough male voice reminded. Then the others chatted with each other for a while. Most of them were talking about recent events. Shinny and the little fairy who were leaning against the door quickly lost interest. The chatter behind the door gradually died down. Then there was the sound of things being dragged away. Finally, there was the sound of the door slamming shut. Everything returned to normal. Have they left? Shinny asked after a while. The two carefully pushed open the iron door. Behind the door was a small room filled with all kinds of junk. Wooden boxes, barrels, broken cabinets, and iron shelves. The little fairy looked around and whispered, "Do you understand what they're saying? Nothing more than revenge. I've seen many humans and they're all like that." Shinny flapped her wings a few times and landed on the little fairy's shoulder. They're so boring. Let's not care about them. We'll go find that bad guy and take revenge ourselves. I feel like you're scolding us too. How could that be? We're avenging for justice. We're different from them. What's different about us? You're not allowed to speak anymore, Shinny. One is marked by the company one keeps. The little elf had learned how to get angry out of humiliation without anyone teaching her. The two walked up the stairs to the basement. They quietly pushed open the door to the basement. Outside the door was still a dark corridor. The crew's people's talent in architecture seemed to be limited to connecting the corridor, the room, the stairs, and finally the outer wall. There was no creativity at all. They carefully passed by the first floor of the bakery. There was no one living there. The rooms were empty as if they had been swept clean. There was also the unique smell of the caveman. Do you know how to go up to the attic? Shinny asked, covering her nose with her claws. The little fairy didn't care at all. She sniffed around with her sharp little nose as if she was a little hunting dog. Then she replied, "Of course I know." "How do you know? Have you been here before?" "Yes, I sneaked up once." "When?" Shinny asked in surprise. "When you weren't there, there was a wild grape rack behind the house. It was easy to climb," the little fairy replied in a low voice. "But then I accidentally got caught on the curtain and fell down and crushed the grape rack. After that, I couldn't climb up again." "After that? You went up several times? Why did you go up there?" The little elf replied, "I want to go up and see where that chubby guy hid the bread." Shinny snorted at the answer. "You wanted to steal the bread, didn't you?" Shinny blushed a little. "He didn't want to sell it to us. Have you ever seen anyone who doesn't pay for something? But I don't have money." "Oh." Shinny scratched her face with her two little claws. "Poor thing. Let's make a deal." "What?" "If you're caught by Aquissa this time, don't tell her that I took you out." "Why?" "Because I don't want to die." Chapter 928. The two girls walked up the stairs to the second floor while bickering, but their voices were as soft as their bodies, so no one noticed them. The second floor was still a long corridor with several rooms on both sides. The doors were closed and it was dark inside. It was hard to guess if the people behind the rooms were the same. But it was most likely because when the two girls tiptoed past some of the doors, they heard faint voices talking behind them. Logically speaking, they should quickly pass through such a dangerous place, but the little elf was interested in listening to the voices inside the room one by one. In the first room, there was the voice of the previous rough man and the voice of the young man called F. The two seemed to be discussing the previous plan, but she couldn't understand a single word, so she left the room in disappointment and went to the next door. Sunil leaned on her shoulder and didn't stop her. Instead, she asked curiously, "Who's inside?" The little elf shook her head, indicating that there was no voice inside. She continued to move forward. In the third door, there were two voices that she hadn't heard before. She guessed that they were the two people who hadn't spoken. "These two are the guards of the owner's wife." After listening for a while, she said to Sunil as if she had discovered a secret, "This candy shop must be very popular. Even the owner's wife has guards." "Because she's not the owner's wife," Sunil replied. "What? Why do you say that?" The little elf raised her eyebrows and asked. "All right, I won't argue with you. If you say so, then so be it." The two girls continued to move forward and came to the fourth door, which was also the last door. Not far away was the end of the corridor where there was a staircase leading to the attic. The little elf stood in front of the door and listened carefully with her pointed ears. Not long after, she heard a strange voice. "It seems that someone is talking." "Is it the old man and the woman?" Sunil asked. The little elf listened and said, "No, it's the old man and the other old man." "How can it be? Then there are 7 people. Maybe one of them didn't go down before. They need someone to keep a lookout." "What are they talking about?" Shinni asked after a moment's thought. The first old man was reporting something to the second old man. The second old man asked the first old man how it was going. The first old man said that it was going well. Then they said something that even the little elf couldn't understand. Something about "long live." It was really strange. Then the second old man urged the first old man to hurry up. The second old man seemed to be complaining about something. "Enough, enough. You're making me dizzy," Sydney interrupted. "Can't you put it in simpler terms?" "But I don't understand what they're talking about." Shani glared at her. "You're such an idiot." Boris Anvil had a resounding name. As a dwarf, he was a member of the famous Anvil family. But unlike his brethren who dug tunnels in the mountains, he yearned for the outside world and not the dull and boring tunnels. In the eyes of everyone, he was an anomaly, which was why he left his people early on and ventured into the human world. Now, he was an alchemist with some reputation. He had a respectable status, received a generous pension, and lived a good life that his compatriots in the tunnels couldn't even imagine. He didn't regret his choice at all. In fact, he was proud of it. But that didn't mean that everything went smoothly. Sometimes he still had to face some troublesome matters. For example, at this moment, he had no choice but to grumble and grumble as he erased the magic circle on the table. Even if someone gave him 500 eagle coins, he wouldn't want to look at that damn face anymore. "Damn it," he muttered to himself. "He makes it sound so easy. You just have to do this and that. Damn it, why didn't he try it himself?" He couldn't help but grumble. "I'm an alchemist, not a spy. Those guys are the real spies. As long as I'm a little careless, they will drag me out, peel my skin and pull out my tendons. I dare to swear in the name of Mother Earth that those cold-blooded people won't even blink an eye. Damn it, if I wasn't blinded by greed, I wouldn't have gotten involved in this mess." Well, even if that's the case, don't think that Uncle Boris is easy to mess with. If you dare to nag at me like this again, Uncle Boris won't do it. I'll let you fools understand that the men of the Anvil family won't be moved by mere silk. The dwarven alchemist opened the drawer as he spoke. Inside the drawer were bottles and jars of potions that he had refined. Of course, these were the less expensive types of potions, which was why he dared to temporarily store them here. As for the truly precious potions, Boris had always kept them close to his body. He took out a green paper package and carefully opened it. It was a portion of sleeping dragon dust. Wizards often use small doses of this potion as incense to induce meditation, but in fact, large doses of sleeping dragon dust had a very strong hypnotic effect. Moreover, this alchemy potion was not rare, so alchemists liked to use it for self-protection. Although Boris had inherited the loud voice and bad temper of the dwarves, he rarely possessed the meticulousness of an alchemist. At the same time, he was like most people who dealt with magic. They all had one thing in common: they cherished their lives very much. Therefore, before going to bed every day, he used to make a simple trap with the sleeping dragon dust to prevent any thieves from stealing his things or even killing him for money. He picked up the sleeping dragon dust, but still felt uneasy, so he grabbed a seed of the shining tree from the drawer and stuffed it into the pouch. Then he walked towards the door. But on this day when he carried the sleeping dragon dust to the door as usual, he unexpectedly heard two chattering voices outside the door. "Nonsense, you're the idiot." Judy didn't understand. "That's because your description was too bad." Judy, who can't even understand the description of the elves, is useless. Then there's no one in this world who can be useful. Lawless. Boris thought to himself. He subconsciously thought that there were two thieves outside his door. Even burglars dare to openly discuss how to split the loot in front of the victim's door, and even brazenly argue. Do they really think that there's no justice here just because the rats of Georgandy Ridge are here? The dwarf angrily opened the door, and the door opened with a click, revealing a human and a dragon outside. The two of them were bickering at the door without any sense of crisis. They didn't expect the door to suddenly open. They were both stunned. A little elf, a pseudo-dragon, and an old dwarf holding the sleeping dragon's dust. The three of them just stood there and looked at each other, speechless. "Who are you?" Boris was stunned. No matter how much the dwarf grumbled, he would not think that the inexplicably cute little girl outside his door was a burglar. But just as he opened his mouth, a gust of cold wind suddenly blew in from outside his room. The winter wind was so cold that the dwarf could not help but shiver. The little elf opposite him opened her mouth wide. Shoo! Boris sneezed a little, and a cloud of green smoke suddenly spread out from his hand and shrouded him. The little elf opened her eyes, and just as she saw this scene, the dwarf alchemist fell to the floor with a thud. The sound of the dwarf falling to the ground was so heavy that a vigilant voice immediately came from the next room. "Who's outside?" Both the elf and Judy opened their mouths wide. Obviously they did not expect to mess things up. They were discovered. That was their first thought. What should they do? That was their second thought, and there was no third thought. The two seemed to be petrified. Those people would definitely open the door and come out to check, and at this time, it would be too late for them to run to the attic, not to mention there were people upstairs. For a moment they were at a loss and did not know what to do. The sound of several doorknobs turning came from the corridor at the same time, and the little elf was so scared that her face turned ashen. "Use the cloak." Judy screamed to remind her. Boris seemed to have just reacted and quickly pulled up the cloak to cover himself and Judy. In a flash, the two figures disappeared from the corridor. The first to open the door and come out was Delphian. Judy had heard the elf describe this woman as very beautiful, but when she saw her face, she realized that it was true. The human girl was wearing a violet dress, and her long hair was tied in a waterfall to her waist. Her hair was the color of black sandalwood. In Cruz and Erwin, only people with the blood of the Myernas could have such pure hair color. Black in the culture of the Cruz people represented mystery and misfortune, but it complemented her quiet temperament. Her eyes were like the stars in the night sky, her nose seemed to be carved out of jade, and her slightly pursed lips had a charm that could make any man go crazy. She stood there, her perfect figure could not be hidden even by the darkness of the night. Even if some people thought that she was the goddess of the night, it seemed to be a matter of course. The others opened the door one after another, and a tall and strong man with a two-handed sword on his back came out. Two men dressed as guards and a young man in a silver robe. When the four saw Boris on the ground, they could not help but exclaim in a low voice, "Boris? What happened?" The two-handed swordsman reacted the fastest. He pulled out his greatsword and rushed to the door of the dwarf alchemist's room. But when he looked inside, the room was empty. It didn't look like someone had broken in. But of course he didn't expect that beside him, the little elf and Judy were hugging each other, shivering. Although the elf's cloak could hide them, it couldn't move. There weren't any obstacles in the corridor, so if these people took a few steps forward, they might bump into them. Delphian frowned, looked at the stairs leading to the attic and said, "Go up and check." Her voice just fell, and the elf and Judy almost hugged each other and burst into tears. Because the two of them were hiding at the stairs leading to the attic, as long as these people passed by, it was impossible not to find them. Hearing Delphian's order, the tall swordsman immediately put away his sword and turned to the attic. But before he could take a step, a cold voice came from the attic. "If I were you, I would choose to stay there obediently." This sudden voice startled everyone. But Xianyi was trying her best to signal the elf with her eyes. She remembered clearly that this was the voice that had knocked them down from the sky. Delphian heard this voice, first signaled the swordsman to stop, then raised her head and asked, "Who are you, sir? What did you do to Boris?" The attic was silent for a moment. Then the voice replied, "I am the same as you, a temporary guest here. As for what happened to your companion, it has nothing to do with me." At this time, the tall swordsman had taken the opportunity to check the status of the dwarf alchemist. He found that the dwarf was lying on the floor, sleeping soundly, and did not seem to be injured. He used his hand to touch some of the green powder on the floor, then sniffed and showed a look of understanding. "It's the sleeping dragon's dust. Boris is careful, he would never make such a mistake," Delphian replied as soon as she heard this. "Even if the sleeping dragon's dust is his own, something must have happened just now. When I came out, I clearly heard the voice of someone else. Lady in the attic, I don't mean to offend you, but I think you must know what happened just now, right?" When the two hiding under the cloak heard this sentence, they knew who she was talking about. They did not expect that the guy in the attic was so powerful that he even knew everything that happened below like the back of his hand. When the two thought of their purpose of coming here, they could not help but tremble in fear. Of course it was nothing, but the more they trembled, the more they trembled. In the end, even the people outside could see it. When the swordsman with the two-handed greatsword saw the distortion in the air, he thought that it was a spatial turbulence and was startled. He quickly stepped back, but then he realized that something was wrong. "Mr. Solons, what's wrong?" Delphian frowned. The swordsman did not answer. Instead, he used his sword to flick the two elves in front of everyone. At that moment they were both wronged and scared. They could not help but burst into tears. "Wah wah wah, don't kill me, mother. I'm going to die." Everyone stared at this scene with their mouths agape. Delphian seemed to have finally recognized the little one in front of her. "It's you," she said in surprise, but suddenly realized something and frowned. "You were eavesdropping on us." I didn't woo." The little elf panicked and denied. "Mr. Solons, catch her first," Delphian said a little angrily. Don't catch me." The little elf was obviously scared out of her wits. She ran up the stairs with tears and snot running down her face. Shani also flew up to block her path. "Little elf, run. I'll stop them." Unfortunately, before she could finish her sentence, Solons grabbed her wings. "False dragon." At first, the swordsman thought that Shani was just a lizard. But as soon as she spoke, he immediately recognized the rare creature. False dragons were very knowledgeable and had high intelligence. They could even cast some small spells. Could be said that they were the rarest magic pet of a wizard. He could not help but shout in surprise. "You're lucky, Miss Delphian. Let me go, you're hurting me, damn big guy." Shani screamed. The little elf's face changed when she heard this. Shani was her best friend. She would not let them take her away. "Let go of Shani." She suddenly turned around and rammed into the tall swordsman. Unfortunately, her small body didn't have any deterrent force. When she rammed into the swordsman's waist, she bounced off and landed on her but beside Boli the dwarf. The two guards and the young man beside Delphian could not help but laugh at the scene. The little elf was scared and angry, but she was more afraid that these people would take Shani away. She took out a dagger with tears in her eyes and threw it at the big guy. Unfortunately, Solons did not even look at it. He flicked the soft dagger away with his hand. She then took off her sword, crossbow bolts, and even flints and threw them at Solons. These things did not hurt him at all, and he was too lazy to care about them. After all, he was a famous swordsman. Naturally, he would not care about a little girl. After the elf finished throwing her things, she grabbed a paper bag from the dwarf beside her and threw it at him. The paper bag hit Solons and scattered into a cloud of red smoke. This time, Solons, who was unprepared, was in big trouble. "Pori's chili powder." He shouted and immediately let go of Shani. He covered his eyes and nose, but tears were already streaming down his face. Shani took the opportunity to fly to the little elf's side and looked at the scene with lingering fear. "Damn it, you guys, stop her." This time it was Solons' turn to shout with tears and snot. He was ashamed and angry. He did not expect to be tricked by a little girl in a moment of carelessness. Delphine looked at this scene and frowned. After receiving a nod from her, the two guards beside her smiled and approached the elf from both sides. The little elf was terrified. When she realized that the thing on Bali's body was very useful, she immediately groped around the poor old dwarf's body. Not long after, she pulled out a round, spherical object from the dwarf's pouch. The others were fine, but the young man behind Delphian could not help but change his expression when he saw the object. "Don't lose it," he shouted, but unfortunately the little fairy obviously couldn't do as he wished. When she heard this shout, her hand trembled in fright, and she directly threw the ball at the young man. "Close your eyes," the young man shouted angrily. Chapter 929. Half an hour ago. Compared to the commotion in Greystone Town, the nearby hills were quiet. On the top of the hill where Erwin's delegation was, everyone was quietly waiting in the pine forest. Due to the fear of the harpies circling in the sky, No one dared to light a fire or do anything out of the ordinary. They even had to speak softly. Everyone was waiting for the sky to turn completely dark. But before that, time became extraordinarily dull and long. Some people were whispering, some were eating dry food to maintain their strength. In the forest, for Knight of the Inner Court were discussing the matter of the North Mountain sentry post. Romain was telling a story to the Grand Duke of Grenoise's daughter. The latter looked at Romain with admiration. Romain had a special ability to tell stories that had not happened yet. She was talking about her merchant group, the merchant ships with huge sails that looked like clouds crossing the shining sea, following the waterway to the bustling port and the wild areas. She talked about the giant beasts that lurked in the distant sea, the storms that brewed on the surface of the sea, the strange fish, and the wonders that were rarely seen in a mortal's life. Although she had never been to those places, she talked about them as if she had seen them with her own eyes. Soon, other people gathered around her. Brando saw Sugar Pot, Dilfrey and Hipamera, the three loyal Roman listeners. Then Chiara and Princess Magadal joined in. The Duke's daughter was counting the stars with keen-eyed. The strange starry sky of Wonde always shone from the east to the west. The night sky was like a black cloth sprinkled with gemstone fragments, shining brightly. A long river of stars had faintly appeared, as if announcing the final arrival of the night. But when the light of the stars and the moon converged, the outside of the forest became brighter, and the silvery valley emitted a faint light under the night sky. Before night fell, Brendel had been asking Cooper about the situation in Greystone Town. The latter also wanted to take advantage of the night to break out of the encirclement, but the defenses in Greystone Town were very tight. Not to mention other things, there was nothing he could do about the harpies in the sky. He did not know much about the current situation in Greystone Town. When Brando asked, he could only vaguely answer a few questions. But as a local noble, he knew Greystone Town very well. He knew where the market was, where the open streets were, where the barracks and towers were, and where the Holy Cathedral was. He knew all about it and could even draw a simple map. Brando's questions were very detailed, which made Cooper very puzzled. He could not help but ask, "Count, are you sure you can take Greystone Town?" "It's hard to say. Everything will only be known after nightfall," Brando replied. "Count, the Georgandy Ridge troops stationed in Greystone Town are not weaker than us. They have the advantage of defense. The individual combat power of the harpies and cavemen is also stronger than our swordsmen and spearmen. Of course, they may not be as strong as your army, but according to my observation, you didn't bring many guards with you, right?" Cooper asked carefully. In Aouin, especially in the south, the nobles' spearmen were at most equivalent to the first tier of soldiers, and their average standard was even lower than the infantry swordsmen and spearmen of the local legions. But in Kurlutz, the nobles' private soldiers were slightly stronger, and could be compared to the swordsmen of the first and second tier legions in Aouin. They belonged to the second tier of soldiers like the subterrane dwellers, but there were differences in strength between the same tier of soldiers. The subterrane dwellers belonged to the upper middle tier of the second tier of soldiers, while the Kurlutz nobles' spearmen and swordsmen could at most be considered as a second tier of soldiers. The human army was slightly better in terms of discipline, but in terms of individual combat power, the difference was too great. The advantage of discipline was often obvious in large legions, but in small-scale battles and ambushes, individual strength could determine the outcome of a battle. Not to mention there were harpies and razor boars in Georgandy Ridge, which were true rank 3 creatures. If there were 1 or 2 nest lords or minotaurs in the town, it would be a disaster for the nobles' army. The Shadow Cavemen were not considered strong in the underground of Georgandy Ridge, but at the same scale, they were comparable to the local army of Cruz. Like the lords that Brando was familiar with in history such as Trock, King of the Blind Shadek, or Beast Tamer, Silica, their armies could fight against the border army of the Kingdom of God. As for existences like Geralt and Medusa, if they went all out, even the frontline army of the Kingdom of God might not be able to deal with them alone. "Knight, what do you think we should do?" Brando asked. "I think we should think of a way to go around them. We have fewer people and they might not be able to find us if we walk through the hills." Cooper thought for a moment and answered hesitantly, as if even he felt that his suggestion was not that reliable. Brando smiled and shook his head. It was impossible for 1 or 2,000 people to march through the hills without being discovered. Not to mention 1 or 2,000 people, even if 100 or 200 people were to move, no matter how dense the trees were, they would not be able to hide. Unless everyone was in groups of a few and scattered into the hills, but that would require a lot of space and time. They did not have the time to do that now. "If we don't get rid of the garrison of Greystone Town, we won't be able to leave this place safely." Sigh, Cooper sighed and felt a little hopeless. Do we have to fight? Is there no other way? Brando saw that he was scared out of his wits by the people of Georgandy Ridge, so he could only comfort him. Knight Cooper, Greystone Town is not as hard to conquer as you think. Cooper only took it as consolation and nodded, glancing listlessly in the direction of the valley. Haruz walked through the dark forest as if attracted by the light outside. He held onto the pine trees with his hands and struggled to walk out. Finally he saw Lysimeka at the edge of the forest. Medusa stood on the edge of the bushes, staring at the white rocks exposed under the moonlight. But the little prince saw that at the same level as the rocks were the shadows entrenched in the valley. That place was called Greystone Town, or so his teacher had told him. Geographically it was the exit of the valley, but he knew that the town was occupied by some special enemies at the moment. Are those your compatriots, Sister Lysimeka? He walked up behind Medusa and asked in a low voice. Compatriots? Not really, Lysimeka replied, having heard the little prince's voice. Haruz looked at her puzzled. Lysimeka looked back at the little prince with a hint of gentleness in her amber eyes. Little cutie, in the human language, Georgandy Ridge is actually just a geographical term, not a country or territory. The real Georgandy Ridge is actually divided into 3 layers, upper, middle, and lower. Each layer is different. The rulers of the shallowest layer are the dwarves, the middle layer is the Georgandy Ridge you are familiar with, the bottom layer is the kingdom of the dark elves, and further down is the river flowing with magma and sulfur. In the dark underground world there are thousands of different ethnic groups. They have never had any concept of a country. Even the most powerful lords often only rule a city and a territory. The smaller tribes are dependent on the lord. Since the beginning of history, everyone has been fighting for themselves and hostile to each other. She sighed as she spoke, and Haruz vaguely felt that he should not have mentioned these things, so he stopped asking. After sending Cooper away, Brando returned to Maynold's side and looked at the scene at the edge of the woodland from a distance. What about that Medusa? He asked, looking back. Her Royal Highness promised to shelter her. His Royal Highness seems to like her very much, Maynold replied, but she did not look over there as if she did not care about it at all. No problem? It's not a big problem. Don't forget that she came with the demon. Brando nodded. In the middle and lower levels of Georgandy Ridge, the natives were feuding with the demon, but there were also a small number of people who had to serve the demon. They were the demon's slaves. With this background, and the fact that she had personally sent the little prince back, it was not without reason that Griffin trusted her so much. There was a moment of silence between the two, looking silently in the direction of the valley. The wind blowing from the hills rubbed the entire pine forest over their heads and rustled. It's getting dark earlier and earlier, Maynold suddenly said. Because it's almost late winter. Maynold glanced at him. The meteor fell near the North Mountain sentry post. There are many witnesses and most people's testimonies can prove this, but most of them don't believe it's true. They generally think it's a trick of Georgandy Ridge. The cavemen are looking for it. Brando nodded. Although most people thought that they were going for Earl Alcorn, he already had the answer in his heart. Maynold looked at him quietly with eyes as quiet as an orchid. Could it be that thing? We'll know soon enough. So confident? That night doubted that you could take this place. Maynold thought of Cooper's face and could not help but curl her lips. Unfortunately, Brando did not notice. He smiled after hearing it. Don't you know what's going on? Although there are many famous generals in this era, we also have our own means. You want to say players? Brando did not want to answer this question rashly. He had been thinking about all this for the past few days. Was history tending to happen or changing? If it was the latter, what was the opportunity? The night was getting darker and darker. It was obviously unrealistic to approach Greystone Town under the watchful eyes of the harpies before the sky turned completely dark. The eyesight of these monsters was comparable to their distant relatives on the surface. In fact, not to mention the valley, as long as one walked out of the dense canopy, there was a possibility that they would be targeted by them. As a reconnaissance unit among the flying units, the harpies were also ranked among the top in Wound. In terms of reconnaissance ability, even the gargoyles of Bugo were slightly inferior to them. However, they were very fragile. They were used to jumping between underground rock formations, and their short wings were very weak in the air. This made them very weak in the air, which made them very weak in the air. However, it was also wishful thinking to get close to Greystone Town after nightfall. Harpies were creatures of the dark. In fact, their eyesight at night was better than during the day. This was because they had slight light blindness, which made it difficult for them to adapt to the daylight of the surface world. According to the Shire, The only way to quietly get close to Greystone Town was for everyone to learn invisibility, if they could find so many wizards to cast spells for more than 1,000 people hidden in the forest. It seemed that the only way was to attack. However, the players were especially good at this kind of small-scale unconventional battle, so Brando and Maynard's choice was usually not that troublesome. When the hour hand on Sir Cooper's silver pocket watch passed the 12 mark, it seemed that there was a breeze in the forest. A small group of gargoyles was taking off from the forest at the top of the mountain. However, looking from above the forest, only the dark canopy could be seen shaking slightly, and the branches seemed to be slightly lowered by the descending airflow. A total of 7 or 8 invisible airwaves swept across the canopy and then disappeared. Under the canopy, the wizards in robes were watching the gargoyles that were enchanted with invisibility take off. Beside them, there was a second group of gargoyles waiting to take off. These gargoyles were like statues in the forest when they were not activated, and their folded wings were almost taller than the treetops. These were the backups of the first group of gargoyles. If possible, everyone present sincerely hoped that they could succeed in one go and not use these backups. Under the cover of the night, it seemed that Martha was on their side, and the plan went far more smoothly than expected. 8 invisible gargoyles rose into the night sky and began to climb. They quickly flew into the clouds and arrived above the harpies in the sky above Greystone Town. The moonlight poured over the clouds, and looking down through the veil-like gaps of the clouds, one could clearly see 4 black dots that were flying in circles. The harpies did not have the slightest premonition of the approaching danger. They were circling in the air in pairs, using their sharp eyes to observe the vast land. In their vision, the mountains and hills gathered under the starlight and moonlight were like miniature sandboxes. The hills were shrouded in a silver mist, and it seemed quiet. At this moment the 8 gargoyles had already locked on to their targets. After they climbed to the highest point, they began to make the final turn and then swooped down. Gargoyles, like the griffins, were heavy flying units, and their wingspans were far wider and stronger than the griffins. This meant that they had the strongest climbing and diving ability among creatures of the same level. In the game, the gargoyles were the Tier 3 troop class closest to the Tier 4 troop class, the griffins were the Tier 4 troop class, and the harpies were the Tier 4 troop class closest to the Tier 3 troop class. The balance of the 3 flying creatures was almost the same, but in terms of scouting ability, the gargoyles were no match for the harpies, and in terms of fighting, the gargoyles were no match for the ferocious griffins. However, in terms of climbing and diving speed, the Buga gargoyles deserved to be called number 1. Needless to say, the gargoyles that swooped down from the clouds were still invisible, and the 4 harpies did not know that disaster was coming from the sky. They only reacted in a panic when the sharp whistling sound reached their ears. But it was a pity. It was too late. The precision of the construct allowed the 8 gargoyles to enter the attack range at the same time, and when they showed their intention to attack, the harpies did not have any reaction at all. They struggled futilely in mid-air, and then the cold claws pierced through their fragile sternum. The 8 gargoyles were almost arranged in a sequence of attack, one in front and one behind, to prevent any fish from escaping, but it turned out that this was just an unnecessary move. The gargoyles swept past and a rain of feathers fell in mid-air. It was a pity that they were too high above the ground, and the feathers fluttered in the air. By the time they landed, they had already drifted to God knows where. In the dark night, no one noticed that the battle in the sky had ended before it even began. The people waiting anxiously on the ground received the message from the gargoyles at the same time. Rogers could not help but excitedly high-five his companions, and the wizards in the forest also high-fived one after another to congratulate him. But at the same time, on the other side of the hill, groups of elves wearing feathered cloaks, wearing clothes that were different from humans, and holding long staffs walked out of the forest. Their faces were painted with various patterns and they looked like barbarians in the mountains, but their pointed ears exposed their identity, tree elven druids. A small group of tree elves had already joined Brando's Mage Legion during the Autumn Twilight War in Erewhon. After the war, more and more tree elves came out of the Black Forest and settled in his territory. This was originally part of the agreement between him and the druids in the Loop of Trade Winds, and with the departure of the Mage Legion with Erewhon's envoy, these tree elves also came to Cruz's land. They faced the night wind and chanted ancient spells, and then one by one, they turned into birds or ravens and flew out of the forest in flocks, flying down the valley in the direction of Greystone Town. Migratory birds often migrated in the areas near the Sea of the Empire, and even in the inland areas, it was not rare to see a flock of ravens wandering on the hills. However, the druids still chose to scatter and enter the town safely. After losing the eyes in the sky, the army of Georgindy Ridge could not notice these scattered flocks of birds. The druids flew into the city and landed in the dark places, dead ends, deep alleys, or secluded courtyards. Then they turned back into human form in a cloud of green light. A few druids in a group took out blue stones from their pockets and placed them on the ground according to a certain pattern, forming large and small magic circles. Next, they began to infuse magic into these stones. Green beams of light extended between the stones like snakes. When each stone was connected together, the space above the magic circle began to vibrate. From the center of the circle, a shining silver line appeared. This silver line expanded to both sides like an open eye in the void, but this eye had no pupil. There was only a strange space shining with blue and white light inside. At this moment, far away in the hills, more than a dozen light gates opened, appearing in front of the White Lion guards and the Kurlut's noble private soldiers who were ready to go. Everyone was stunned by the scene in front of them. "The Bugis teleportation circle," Rogers exclaimed. He looked at Brando with a complicated expression. "The craftsman wizards are supporting you." Brendel smiled and said, "Sir Knight, if you speak any louder and Sir Cooper hears you, he might start to suspect your identities." Rogers' expression changed, and he thought that it was more important for him to hide his identity as an internal knight, so he carefully closed his mouth. Chapter 930. We'll split into 3 groups. Rogers, you and Earl Jean will seize the west gate of Greystone Town and ensure that we have a way out. I'll let the Shire go with you to deal with the high-level creatures in Jorgandi Ridge's army. Brando looked at the 4 knights of the internal court and deliberately emphasized the words, Earl Jean. In fact, everyone present understood that Brando was handing over the command of Earl Jean's private army to the 4 internal court knights. As for the so-called going with Earl Jean, it was just a fig leaf to avoid embarrassing the Earl. Earl Jean could only let out a low snort not far away to vent his dissatisfaction. He had no choice but to lower his head when he was under someone else's roof. Moreover, to be honest, this arrangement was quite to his liking. At least, it was much better than having his army stolen by the other party. Of course, in terms of attitude, he would definitely not be nice to Brando. In response to Brando's order, Rogers nodded silently. He knew that the young archmage was not only here to help them, but also to monitor them. The Earl would not be completely at ease leaving the army to Cruz's people. Brendel saw that Rogers had no objections and nodded in satisfaction. He trusted the Queen's inner court knights. Rogers was an upright person and did not have the bad habits of a noble. He continued, Medisa? But suddenly he saw the merchant girl jumping and waving at him with all her might. He could not help but sigh. All right, Romaine, I'll leave the diplomatic group to you. There's a bakery in Greystone Town called Rove's Compass. There's a secret passage there that leads to the lower reaches of the Silver Stream Valley. He looked at Rogers. That bakery was actually the secret base of the Inner Court Knights in Greystone Town. This information was also given to him by the latter. Rogers nodded in confirmation. Brendel turned back. Miss Nasha will bring you and the diplomatic group to find that place. Medisa will also lead a squadron of White Lion infantry to protect you. Also, I'm leaving everyone's safety to you, so this time you have to at least act more seriously. Romaine nodded in confirmation. Brendel turned back. Miss Nasha will bring you and the diplomatic group to find that place. Medisa will also lead a squadron of White Lion infantry to protect you. The merchant girl's eyes sparkled as she nodded vigorously. Brando was still not at ease seeing him like this. He simply said to the Duke's daughter, Miss Eugenie, I'll have to trouble you. The Duke's daughter turned her head away, not wanting to see him at all. She said coldly, I'll naturally be responsible for my own safety. Then she added, Besides, I think the Roman lady is much more reliable than you. At least she won't start a war for no reason. That's because you still don't have enough contact with her. Brando criticized in his heart, thinking that the young lady would soon regret her words. However, the diplomatic group would not encounter too much trouble on this route, so he dared to leave it in the hands of the Roman. Even if there was a battle, among the people accompanying them were Eek and the sergeant from Yanalasu. In addition, among the captives of the Cruz, there were also the Knights of the Summer Solstice Knight Regiment. Among them there was even the vice-commander, Blofeld, who was at the peak of the gold level. In addition to Medisha, their safety was still guaranteed. The order he gave to the diplomatic group was to guard the entrance of the secret passage. If there was an unpredictable situation on the other routes, then they could at least retreat through the secret passage. This was the worst-case scenario, and it could be considered as leaving a backup plan for the whole plan. As for the last route, Brando glanced at Sir Cooper, who was not far away. Cooper still did not know what was happening in the sky at this moment. The attack of the gargoyles was carried out in complete secrecy. On the side of Cruz, only the 4 internal knights knew about it, so the knight was still dejected at this moment, with a hopeless look on his face. "Sir Cooper," he asked, "would you like to come with me to deal with Count Alcorn and the other imperial nobles?" Cooper was slightly startled, then slowly raised his head to look at him. His expression was as if he was looking at a psychopath. "Why, Sir Cooper, if I remember correctly, you should be the retainer of the Count. Is your loyalty to the Count only limited to this?" Brando asked again. Cooper licked his dry lips and replied, "With all due respect, Count Tonagel," he stammered a little and replied, "your plan sounds perfect, but the problem is, you don't seem to have said how we should enter the city. Should we fly in?" "Fly in?" Brando smiled and shook his head. "That would be too slow." He snapped his fingers lightly. In an instant, a dozen light doors opened in front of everyone. Cooper was almost stunned by the scene in front of him, and Rogers even whispered, "The Bugis teleportation circle." He looked at Brando with a complicated expression. "Count, the craftsman mages are indeed supporting you." Brando put his index finger to his lips and smiled. "Mr. Knight, you know so much. If Sir Cooper hears you a little louder, he might start to suspect your identity." Rogers' expression changed, and he thought that hiding his identity as an internal knight was more important for him, so he cautiously shut his mouth. Cooper seemed to finally recognize these things. He had been fortunate enough to see the door of flame of the Holy Cathedral of Fire. Although these portals were not as spectacular as the opening of the door of flame, the aura that represented space and time was the same. He stammered and asked, my lord, this is a portal." "Correct answer, but no bonus points," Brando replied with a chuckle. A white light flashed in the portal, and Brando and Maynard appeared in the secluded courtyard one after another. The teleportation circle continued to flash behind the two of them, and Cooper and his guards appeared one by one, followed by Yuta and a small group of white lion swordsmen. The tree elf druids who were quietly guarding the courtyard immediately bowed when they saw Brando. Brando nodded to them in return. At this time, the Nightsong Tiger came in from outside the courtyard with the two sisters, Falerne and Tia. When he saw Brando, he put his hand on his chest and bowed like a knight. "My lord." "Are you ready?" Brando asked. "We're ready. We've captured a group of subterranean dwellers. Just as our lord said, their loyalty is built purely on the mentality of relying on the strong. They don't have any sense of honor. When we interrogated them, they spilled the beans." The Nightsong Tiger answered very easily. The level of the White City Vanguard card was based on the level of the Fran Knight. Now that Medisha had the strength of an elemental awakener, and they were almost at the level of a lower gold, a few subterranean dwellers were a piece of cake for them. "Do any of you know Jorgendigang?" Brando originally thought that he could show off the Jorgendigang language that he inherited from Sophie, but he did not expect that someone in the Nightsong Tigers group would know this obscure language. His little sense of superiority was instantly shattered, but he was more curious. In the whole of Wonde, other than the dwarves in the mountains, there was not much contact with the underground inhabitants of Jorgendigang. Due to the isolation of the beehive, the underground and the surface kingdoms were almost two separate worlds. Furthermore, the Jorgendigang language was derived from the ancient Dwarven language, which was very different from the Cruz language that originated from the Myrna language. Even scholars rarely studied this language. Dia, who was standing beside Falerne, was all smiles. She opened her mouth and said a lot of strange words to him. Brendel almost jumped out of his skin when he heard it. Isn't Dia speaking Georgentile Gaogen? She also had a strong subterranean dweller accent which made him think, that's right, that's the smell. He almost couldn't resist the urge to ask the little girl if her family knew that Xiao could speak Ganji so well. However, when he looked at the stern-faced Falerne beside him, he couldn't bring himself to ask. Most likely they knew. Secondly, he wanted to make fun of Dia. If Falerne lost her temper later, he wouldn't be able to handle it. In the end, Brando could only ask in surprise, Tia, when did you learn Jorgendigang language? Tajiv taught me, the wild elf answered proudly. Isn't that awesome, brother Brando? Very good. Brendel was not stingy with his praise, causing the latter to chuckle. After chatting for a while, Brando asked the Nightsong Tiger, what did they say? I've told you everything I can. As you've guessed, the Lord of the Shader Dwellers is TMU. He lives in the north of here. These blind people don't know the way, so I've deduced from their descriptions. There are some other places to refer to. The street is very wide and there's a square with a fountain in the middle. TMU is stationed there. The Nightsong Tiger pondered for a moment, as if he was organizing his words, then answered cautiously. Brando looked at Cooper, who had yet to recover from the teleportation. It was not until Brando patted him on the shoulder that the Nightsong Tiger asked, "What's wrong?" The Nightsong Tiger had no choice but to repeat it again. This time, Cooper finally understood. "I know that place. It's called St. Shangda Square. There's an inn called the Silver Bell there. I once stopped there when I passed by Greystone Town. It seems that it's the central area of the city." Brando said, "Our subterranean dwellers are quite good at picking places." Cooper was a little surprised. "Isn't this your first time in the Empire, Count?" Brando smiled. "The central area of the city is surrounded by the most prosperous areas of the city. Why would my lord stay in a secluded alley?" Cooper was enlightened. "Since you know that place, I'll have to trouble you to lead the way." Brando looked at the dark sky and reminded the Nightsong Tiger. The harpies would change shifts every hour or two, which meant that the residents of Georgandy Ridge would sooner or later discover that they were under attack. Although there was still plenty of time, it was not the time for idle chatter. Cooper was a little hesitant. He looked left and right and found that other than the druids in the courtyard, Brando's entourage was only the small group behind him and the Nightsong Tiger. Although he thought that Tia and Falerne were at most maids and there might be a few more outside the door, it was still a little too little. He could not help but show a bitter expression. "With all due respect, Count Brando, isn't it a little too rash for us to ambush the Lord of Georgandy Ridge with just a few people? Is it still a surprise attack when there are so many of us?" The Nightsong Tiger replied with some disdain. Brando was not surprised by the nature of these nobles. He comforted the Nightsong Tiger. "Sir, do you think I'll bring you along with me to die?" Cooper thought for a while and felt that it was more likely that Brando would send him to his death, and there was no reason for him to die with him. He also remembered that the Count of Erewhon had a good reputation. Before this, he had personally asked his comrades who were captured by Brando. Although all of them, including Count Jean, wished that the country bumpkin from Erewhon would meet with misfortune, they did not deny that Brando treated them well. At least in this aspect, he still had the demeanor of a noble. Thinking of this, Sir Cooper felt that he had grasped onto a life-saving straw, or rather, a calming pill. He hesitantly nodded to Brando. Although St. Shangda Square was located in the most prosperous area in the center of Greystone Town, it did not refer to the geometrical center of the town. After 2 or 3 expansions, the town had long exceeded the boundaries of the city walls. In the hinterland of the empire where the fires of war had not been burned all year round, such a situation was very common. St. Shangda Square was located in the heart of the old town. The 5 main streets that led to the 5 gates of Greystone Town converged here, forming a large open-air square. Surrounding the square were shops, hostels, local chambers of commerce, and a series of tall buildings. Of course, the most majestic building under the night sky was the temple of the god of pottery, Kalidas. However, the god of pottery was extremely unlucky. Last time in Buchi, the undead of Madara only managed to destroy one wall of his temple. Now, this group of subterranean dwellers had directly used the temple as an army camp. Brando and his entourage hid behind a wall next to a nearby shop. When the Nightsong Tiger saw this scene, he could not help but twitch his mouth and said, "Although these subterranean dwellers are blind, they can still differentiate between good and bad. They actually used the temple as a place for them to eat, drink, and defecate." Although this was the era of mortals, and the gods had left Wand for thousands of years, and the Dark Dragon and the 4 sages had established a new order on the earth, the people of Martha had never forgotten the gods' favor in the ancient times. Many people still believed that the gods would one day return to Wand. The monks of the Holy Cathedral of Fire were devout believers of Martha, and did not intend to stop this saying. Moreover, the divine spells of the priests had never failed, which proved that the protectors of order were still responding to the call of their people. This saying was very popular in the countryside, especially in the south of Cruz and Erewhon. Poor Sir Cooper was such a devout believer, and when he heard the Nightsong Tiger's blasphemous words, his face turned pale. However, he did not dare to say that the Nightsong Tiger was wrong, because even in his opinion, these damned subterranean dwellers had gone too far. There was a fountain in the middle of St. Shangda Square, and the statue in the fountain was said to be a full-body portrait of the local founder, Mr. Shangda. Unfortunately, the statue had fallen from its pedestal and was smashed into pieces. There were 2 razor boars next to the statue, drinking from the fountain. Not far from them, their tamers, more than 10 purple-colored long-maned subterranean dwellers, were either standing or sitting on the marble steps of the Holy Cathedral. They were communicating in a language that most of the people present did not understand. How vulgar! Even Brando could not help but shake his head. The subterranean dwellers were not civilized, and they only believed in the mysterious spirits of the dark caves. It was unrealistic to expect them to maintain basic respect for Cruz's history and culture. He pointed to the rooftops of the nearby buildings and said, "Tia Falerne, you two take care of these noisy things." He was referring to the harpies on the rooftops. There were a total of 7 harpies monitoring the entire square from the top of the Chamber of Commerce and the Noble Assembly. They were especially alert in the dark, constantly leaping up and down, attacking each other and making shrill noises. It was very annoying. "No problem," Falerne replied, and Tia nodded firmly. Brando then pointed to the subterranean dwellers at the entrance of the Holy Cathedral and said, "Yuta, I'll leave these to you. There's a total of 18 rats. Don't let them make a sound." The White Lion Guards that accompanied the diplomatic party were basically the best of the best. The 10 chosen for this raid were the best of the best, and each of them was at least a mid-silver. They could even put up a fight against a razor boar. Brando was not worried at all that they could not deal with a group of subterranean dwellers. Yuta hesitated for a moment. She brushed her flame-like hair away from her forehead, but she still nodded. "There are 2 razor boars left. I'll take care of one and leave the other to your guard captain. These things don't have much intelligence. Just don't let them make too much noise," Brando said as he looked at Cooper's guard captain. "Mr. Walton, what do you think?" Walton, a swordsman who made his name in Ludwig, had a pair of thick eyebrows. He looked at Brando suspiciously, as if he was doubting the strength of this young man. But in the end he still nodded. "Maynard, stay here with the druids to deal with any unexpected situations," Brando said. "Yes," the knight replied calmly. Chapter 931. Stars twinkled in the night sky. Brando stared at the ceiling of the Chamber of Commerce and the Chamber of Commerce for several minutes. He waited for the harpies to land for the 3rd time before he finally gave the order, "Let's do it." Light flashed between Falerne's fingers, and 4 harpies 100 meters away from her were pierced by dark blue arrows. The arrows pierced through their hearts, and they immediately turned into ice sculptures with a cracking sound. Battle wizards could draw spells from the circle of curses, and their casting speed was extremely fast. However, elven messengers were slower by half a beat. Tia's reaction was even slower. She tried her best to finish reciting every single word of the spell. She pushed her hands forward, and everyone saw an invisible ripple sweep across the sky above the plaza. It swept across the bodies of the fleeing harpies. In an instant they were torn to pieces, turning into a rain of blood that fell from the sky. Tia didn't expect her spell to have such a great effect. She couldn't help but stick her tongue out at Brando apologetically. "A gas storm blade," Brando muttered to himself. "Is it really necessary to use a Circle 7 spell against 3 harpies?" At this time, the subterranean dwellers in the square were alarmed. Although they couldn't see, they could hear the commotion. The subterranean dwellers at the entrance of the Holy Temple panicked and grabbed their weapons. Suddenly, a wave of crossbow bolts flew out from the darkness, and the pitiful creatures fell to the ground as if they had hit an invisible wall. The remaining 3 or 4 subterranean dwellers didn't even have time to react before the White Lion Guards pierced through their hearts with swords. The next unlucky ones were the patrol team. Yuta personally intercepted them. The female mercenary leader's flame-like hair was like an eye-catching flag in the dark night. It danced up and down with her movements, and the crimson fire raven's tongue shone brightly. When Brando saw the sword, he was stunned for a moment. Only then did he remember that he had given the sword to the mercenary leader. The fire raven's tongue seemed to have been given life in Yuta's hands. She raised her hand and turned the sword into a flaming whip. The golden-red whip swept across a distance of 34 meters, wrapping around 4 or 5 fleeing subterranean dwellers and turning them into ashes. The rest of the subterranean dwellers were unable to resist the White Lion Guards. One by one they fell to the ground and were slaughtered. Cooper looked at the sword in Yuta's hand and then looked at the beautiful figure of the female mercenary leader. He couldn't help but look back at Brando enviously, thinking that the young man was really lucky. At this moment there were only 2 razor boars left in the square. These beasts that came from the underworld were extremely huge, almost as big as a cow. They had 4 pairs of fangs that were arranged side by side. Each pair was more than half a meter long, just like a sharp, snow-white scimitar. That was how the name razor boars came about. After the Chadre cavemen domesticated them, they put on metal masks and eye masks, further reducing their weaknesses. Hence, they became the beasts that lived up to their name. These creatures had a violent temperament and were famous killers in the underworld. However, their brains seemed to be burned by the constant anger, and their intelligence was extremely low. Wild razor boars attacked all enemies that entered their territory, and sometimes even their mates. Even after they were domesticated, their only target was their tamer. When all the subterranean dwellers in the square were killed, the two razor boars came to their senses. Naturally, their first choice was not to howl loudly to call for their companions. Instead, they immediately buried their heads and charged at the humans who appeared in their sight. Walton and Brando stood in front of the two razor boars, one on the left and the other on the right. Walton had been famous in Ludwig for a long time. Other than his swordsmanship, his strength was also at the peak of the gold tier. However, he didn't dare to be too careless in the face of these crazy boars. When the razor boar charged at him, he dodged to the side and used crews to slash at the big guy's hooves. The razor boar's hooves were cut off, and its head slammed into the ground. It opened its mouth and wanted to scream, but before the sharp air could rush out of its throat, Walton's sword pierced its throat and sealed it in its stomach. The tragic sound of the slaughtered boar eventually turned into the sound of the air hitting the broken trachea, and dirty blood gushed out. Walton looked at the dead razor boar lying on the ground and couldn't help but nod in satisfaction. He was obviously very satisfied with the way he handled the situation. To be able to end the battle so cleanly, it meant that his understanding of swordsmanship had improved by another step. However, he was a little surprised that the young count hadn't made a move yet. Logically speaking, no matter who won or lost, there should be some movement. Even if Walton handled the situation so cleanly, the razor boar still made a loud noise when it hit the ground. Of course, Walton didn't think that Brando could be stronger than him. He had followed Cooper for a long time, and although he hadn't heard much about the Count's strength, he had heard about his impulsiveness and arrogance. When Brando attacked the Black Sword Fortress, the Empire only said that the Count had a genuine archmage by his side. Walton didn't believe that Brando was a swordsman in his early 20s. But when he turned around, he saw a scene that left him dumbfounded. Brando stood still, and not far away the razor boar was lying on the ground, trembling like a sieve. It was so scared that it wet its pants, and it didn't dare to take half a step forward. All the young men of the White Lion Guards, including the female mercenary leader, looked at their lord with reverence. Walton wasn't ignorant, and he naturally understood what had happened. The might of a swordsman. In the natural world, only a few creatures that had reached a certain level of power could naturally produce pressure, such as dragons or mythical creatures that couldn't be described with words outside the elemental frontier. However, for the Iron Folk, only those who had reached a certain level of strength in a domain and had even grasped the principles of the laws could produce pressure. The power of the laws, the power of the Sword Saint. In order to reach this level, the only condition that had to be fulfilled was the enlightenment of truth. Brando did indeed feel the existence of the laws of nature at that moment, and even he didn't know what had happened. The moment he pulled out his sword and pointed it at the razor boar, a mysterious knowledge responded from the Howran Gaia. At that moment he seemed to understand the meaning of mountains and rivers, and the meaning of eternity. But this was just a story that happened in an instant. It was as if he had truly stepped into the realm of the elemental enlightenment for a moment, but in an instant he had returned to the peak state of elemental activation. But in just a moment of the elemental enlightenment, the pressure naturally exuded from his body was enough to frighten the razor boar, which lacked intelligence. Brando had a faint premonition in his heart. He withdrew his sword, looked at the razor boar lying on the ground and said to the others, "Don't worry about this thing, it won't be able to react for a while. Quickly attack the temple." As he said this, he raised his head and silently glanced at the dark night sky. Unknowingly, dark clouds had covered the starlight. Perhaps it was because of the blessing of the god of pottery, Kalidas, or some other reason, the battle to enter the temple was very smooth. The troglodytes stationed in the temple didn't expect the changes outside at all. When the White Lion Guards attacked the temple, they were caught off guard and lost the initiative. The rest of the battle was almost a one-sided massacre. Although Tanu's Bugbear Guards launched a fearless counterattack, these Grade 4 creatures from the underground of Jorgandi Ridge were obviously better at fighting in caves than on the surface. Under the attack of Yuta, Maynard, and Walton, the White Lion Guards almost wiped out Tanu's guards at the cost of one minor injury. The battle ended faster than expected. Tanpu was the lord of the Shadar subterranean dwellers. But that was it. The subterranean dwellers were the lowest existence in Jorgandi Ridge, and their status was only slightly higher than that of the ground dragon. Tanpu was most famous in the underworld for having a minotaur as a slave. With this Tier 6 creature, he occupied a small territory at the edge of the Tranquil Lands and built up his prestige among his fellow subterranean dwellers. He raised an army and became the lord of the Tranquil Lands, but his power was only slightly stronger than the banished Tajiv. This time, The minotaur he had always relied on was only able to withstand a few blows from Walton before its head was chopped off. The stench of blood spurted out from the minotaur, who was hiding behind the minotaur, and it almost fainted. When Janna dragged him out of the holy temple, the Lord had lost all of his former majesty. Instead, he was like a rooster that had fallen into water, shivering in fear. "My lord, this guy doesn't know much, but he has told us everything he can," Yuta said. "Why don't you ask him again?" Brando glanced at Tanu but shook his head and replied anxiously, "Don't waste my time. Just tell me what he said." Yuta was slightly startled and looked at Brando strangely. Maynard, who had followed them out, did not have as many concerns as the mercenary commander. She also noticed something unusual in Brando's tone and asked, "What happened?" Brendel shook his head gently. He vaguely felt that the sword from before was a little unusual. The feeling that came from the ground was definitely not his own understanding of the laws, but some kind of connection. He just happened to feel this connection at the right time. He remembered the legend of Jorgandi Ridge. Before the Great Schism, the people of the underworld did indeed believe in the same god as the Lion Men of Toquinen. This legend made him feel a little uneasy, as if it was connected with some of the doubts he had in the past few days. However, he could not find the key point for the time being. There was another thing that puzzled him. That feeling was clearly coming from the sky, but the sky was not the traditional territory of the Jorgandi Ridge. This made Brendel unable to tell what he felt for a while. Yuta looked at the female knight and then at her liege. She did not dare to let the latter wait for too long. She whispered, "I'm afraid even this guy doesn't know how big the invasion of Jorgandi Ridge is this time. But my liege, according to his description, I'm afraid it's not small." This was within Brendel's expectations, and Janna's words only confirmed his conjecture. Brendel threw away the messy thoughts in his mind and cleared his mind. He asked, "How many units of Jorgandi Ridge's army are stationed in Greystone Town? Who is the main force of Jorgandi Ridge's army in this direction? You should know, right?" "There are only 2 troops of Jorgandi Ridge stationed in Greystone Town. The other liege is called Goku Brother Brando." Tia answered first. Yuta nodded as if she was testifying, indicating that Tanu's words were translated by Tia. Goku? Brando felt that he had heard this name before. But when he thought about it, he realized that this name did not seem to belong to any well-known liege in Jorgandi Ridge. It was not even as famous as Tanu. Tanu was one of the only 2 liege lords of the Chadre cavemen. In addition to his Minotaur slaves, he was somewhat famous in this regard. What made him feel strange was that, theoretically speaking, a lord that he had heard of would definitely not be unknown. Brando could not help but wonder if his memory was wrong. He turned back to Maynard for help, but he found that the female knight was also frowning as if she was thinking about the same problem as him. "What about the other problem?" he asked again. "The liege who is now marching toward Azaf seems to be a guy called Moksha, but this guy can't explain it clearly. He's really useless." Tia glanced at Tanu and replied, "Moksha." Brando was slightly startled. "So it's him, the king of the lizard men. He is considered a lord second only to Geralt and Medusa. If he is the commander of Jorgandi Ridge's attack on Azaf, then the forces of Jorgandi Ridge invading the surface world this time will not be too small. At least there must be a real king of the underground in the south." The wild elf sister smiled and replied, "Brother Brando, you guessed right. The Jorgandi Ridge army that is attacking Rokizi, the Broken Sword Mountain Fortress group, is the army from the Venom Swamp. The Medusa Queen." Brando immediately reacted, but he was not too nervous. After all, it was the Empire that was in trouble now, and it had nothing to do with him. No matter how powerful the Medusa Queen was, it was impossible for her to turn north from Rokizi Plateau to cause trouble for him. He asked a few more questions and Tia answered them one by one. But as Yuta said, Tanu knew very little. He did not even know the real reason why Jorgandi Ridge invaded the surface world. As for why he appeared here, it was because he was forced to participate in the war by a more powerful lord. This was a common occurrence in the Underdark, and Brando was not surprised. In the end, Brando asked about the whereabouts of Count Alcorn and his men. These unlucky imperial nobles were locked in the underground tomb of the Holy Cathedral by Tanu. At this moment, Sir Cooper had led his men to rescue them. But it was conceivable that the cavemen did not have the superfluous bearing of nobles. It was almost imaginable what would happen to Count Alcorn and his men if they fell into their hands. Even if they did not die, they would probably lose a layer of skin. Speaking of this matter, Brando could not help but think maliciously that if the Count had known about this earlier, he might have taken the initiative to surrender to him and would rather be a captive of Erwin's men. At the same time, Tia's description of the crew's noble's encounter also confirmed another premonition in Brando's heart. The fact that the Shotter cavemen did not value these crew's captives meant that they were not targeting Count Alcorn at all. In other words, the Count was captured by these cavemen on the way. However, Brando did not have time to sigh for the unlucky Count at this moment. He immediately looked at Maynard and asked, "Did you find that thing?" Maynard nodded. Then she took out an item. The item in her palm was not even the size of her palm. It was a bit like an enlarged platinum coin. This kind of gold coin was widely used in the Fanzine area. Because of the special casting process, its surface was brighter than ordinary gold coins. However, the metal disc in the female knight's hand was even brighter than ordinary platinum coins. It was like a sparkling gemstone with metallic characteristics, but there was no obvious crystallization structure. And if one looked closely, one would even find that this metal disc contained a faint glow of flames. Anyone could tell at a glance that this metal disc was not an ordinary item because all the metals and forging techniques in the mortal world could not create the same thing. Even if it was similar, it seemed unlikely. Jana's attention was drawn to the metal disc the moment she saw it. She stared at it as if she was possessed. It took her a long time to react. "What is this? It's so beautiful," she blurted out. Brando heard this sentence and could not help but smile bitterly. Such an item, in Yuta's eyes, was only beautiful, but for anyone who had ever seen it, it was the most precious treasure in the world. Wand had two things that mortals could not touch. The first was fate and the second was the law. But Martha finally gave mortals the power to change everything. The master of fate lies in the amber key, and all the whispers between heaven and earth are recorded on the stone tablet. Pale Poem, verse 4, paragraph 3. P.S. Silly miss, also I beg for monthly votes. Everyone, seeing that I'm working so hard today, I hope you won't be stingy with your votes. You're tuning in to the Han Lee's Wuxia Adventures YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.